Why don't we go get started, Ira? Ready? All right, we've got a pretty full agenda, so I think we need to make sure that we reserve enough time to get to the budget guidance. So I'm hoping that on the previous items we can move through pretty quickly. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So the first item on the agenda is the Transportation Comprehensive Plan chapter, and it's for a framework discussion. It's not really for decision at this point. Why don't you go ahead and lead us off on that?
Thank you, Mayor Baruch, members of council. Yes, indeed. This is simply a chance to have a conversation with the City Council about a way forward and a framework for moving forward on transportation planning in the city. And what we have put forward in the memo that's in your packet is moving forward with a focus on mobility for all modes of transportation through an update of our comprehensive plan, which has its transportation chapter. And in the plan, it lays out the high-level vision and goals that the city has for transportation planning, our desired future state for transportation in the city. It also lays out specific goals and objectives. And so we would propose that that's a good platform to carry forward with a discussion of transportation policy in the city with respect to all modes of transportation: bicycles, pedestrians, transit vehicles, all modes. Specifically for projects, what we would propose is that the comprehensive plan be an opportunity to identify specific areas in the commercial sectors where we want to make improvements. And there are big needs for transportation improvements in our commercial districts, and to lay those out specifically in the comprehensive plan. In our residential districts, we would propose to be broader in terms of just laying out sort of larger goals, but not to try to identify specific projects in our residential districts. We were also in discussions internally about laying out a new process for doing projects in residential areas. We have the neighborhood traffic calming program. There, I think, is an opportunity to build on that, to make that program more effective, but also to have, when we're considering sidewalk improvements or other types of pedestrian improvements in residential neighborhoods, to allow that to be grassroots driven, to be that, and have that be citizen driven in terms of coming to the city saying we would like to have certain improvements on our street, and then have a process in which we would receive multiple applications over a period of time, and then rank those and prioritize those. In effect, have a competitive process for the allocation of scarce resources to make sidewalk and other types of traffic calming and pedestrian improvements in residential districts. So that's the broad framework that we've been discussing internally. We wanted to get council's feedback on that approach. And then we'd also like to take the opportunity, while we're talking about these types of things, to very briefly discuss a meeting we had on Saturday about two sidewalk projects or pedestrian projects, and one on Roosevelt and one on West Street, and give you a briefing on that. But before we go into the details of that, let me ask Paul if there's anything to add to what I just described, and then get council's feedback on that.
Sure. Thank you, Wyatt. Thank you, Mayor Baruch, members of council. Wyatt did a good job of summing up the information in this memo. The one thing I do want to highlight is the idea is that the comp plan would call for specific functional plans, and these would be similar in scale and design to the bus stop and bus shelter master plan. Be a small plan identifying design goals and guidelines, and then it would include a public process for talking about specific projects, and the implementation would happen at a later date.
Give Councilmember Berry a chance to sort of speak to this issue, since she's been spearheading this for the council.
Yeah, I think it's it's clear that this process has been in some respects flawed. It has not been flawed in terms of, I think, the city staff's engagement of the public, but I think there have been some significant disconnects between what the staff really believed was its brief, and how how in some cases certain neighborhoods reacted to it, and appropriately so. I understand that. So I just would like to congratulate staff for focusing back on traffic calming, on safety, and on the importance of a citizen-driven process. But any plan needs internal integrity and context, and I think one of the largest disconnects at the time was, did this plan make sense? And I think what staff has focused on does begin to help citizens understand that this plan actually does make sense. It's not an academic exercise. It's an actual, proactive look at how you move citizens through this city. It's no larger or smaller than that. And so I for one, am happy that the staff has come back, and that this plan has not been abandoned, and that the extraordinary work that the volunteer group over years put together, there were, I can't remember now, I certainly remember sitting in the groups of, 15 members of the city, plus members of various committees, put, an inordinate amount of work forward in this. And I continue to think that their work needs to be respected and appreciated. And I'm very happy that staff has figured out a way to again, make this make sense, to take it from the academic to the real, and be responsive to communities, but create that sort of, that difficult balance between what is citizen-driven and what is important for the larger community. And you will always have, and I'm certain, as I leave council, I understand that there will always be opportunities for citizens to weigh in, but in sometimes larger initiatives, it may not be appropriate to hold them hostage to particular neighborhoods. And so what I think is important is that this process, as you've laid out, engages the neighborhoods. It doesn't hold people hostage, but engages the neighborhoods. And I think that's, in the long run, very important. Again, traffic calming, safety, and it's also, coherent and a part of our mission statements, our vision statements, and that which we say we want to do as a city. So thank you all very much for your work.
Thank you, Ms. Berry. Other council members?
I'll go.
Mr. Tarr?
So to be honest with you, I looked over this staff report, and I'm not sure, after looking it over, what it means. In other words, it seemed like you were alluding to the PED plan.
Yes.
But so what is the status of the PED plan as relates to what we just see here today?
Sure. So the PED plan, as Councilmember Berry said, had a lot of work put into it. And as I said in the memo, that plan was under development from 2010 to 2013, and that involved a lot of late meetings with a lot of citizens here at City Hall. And so that work is not being discarded. At the same time, the plan isn't going to be pushed forward by staff. So what staff is going to use that for is the fact base. So there was a lot of data collection that went along with developing that draft plan, identifying gaps in the sidewalk network, where is it hard to cross the street, where are there ADA problems. So that fact base still exists, and that's part of now the city's knowledge. In terms of moving forward, the PED plan actually had a number of components to it. There were ADA repairs, there were pedestrian spot fixes, there were bicycle routes, and those things can be broken apart and attacked individually. So you could put together a functional plan for how do we repair ADA problems in the city. You could put together a functional plan for where should the bicycle routes go in the city. And how those bicycle routes get implemented would be part of a later discussion, but the idea is you stand up smaller plans that you can have targeted community discussions about what are the general design guidelines that should be followed.
So your idea, or staff's idea, is to basically disregard the conclusions of the PED plan, take the empirical data that was gathered, the measurement of where the curbs need to be fixed or the sidewalks need to be fixed, but essentially disregard the conclusions of it, and then at some later point, create your own plan for the specific subgroups or sub-areas dealt with in the PED plan?
I think disregard is a strong term. That the plan was based on existing policies and strategies that are laid out in the city's comprehensive plan. And so I think you would come to some very similar conclusions, but certainly there would be another public process for how to get to that point.
So you're proposing a public process for these different sub-plans that you're going to come up with?
Yes, and it would be similar to how the bus shelter master plan was developed. That was done in coordination with the CACT, in coordination with the Planning Commission, and we could stand up additional groups as needed for these individual plans.
Just out of curiosity, have you got feedback from the members of the PED plan on what you're proposing?
No, not yet.
Okay. And what is your timetable for coming up with these sub-plans?
The sub-plans would stand in line. You can see in the back of the memo there's a framework for getting the transportation chapter updated. The earliest that would be done would be March, and that's to allow for public involvement through the boards and commissions, through other public meetings, in order to stand up the framework and the priority for what do the city residents really want to focus on first. Is our bicycle routes the number one priority? If so, put it first in the plan and staff can get to work on that. Our ADA fix is the number one priority? If so, put that in the work plan first. So this framework that would go through at least March, the idea is to set priorities for what does the city want to see changed first in the city.
So your framework is just an association with the comprehensive plan?
Correct.
Which is a pretty broad and frankly somewhat nebulous proposal, right? I mean, it's a general document. It's not a street-by-street document, and generally speaking, it's not. I mean, I have to say that I'm a little concerned. I understand why people are gun-shy about this plan. There was a lot of controversy, and, you know, I suspect a lot of people don't want to relive or recreate the controversy that occurred. I think there's some areas that were definitely very controversial. Parking in a couple streets, I don't think anybody wants to go there and take that parking away. I think that issue's been resolved. But I would also say I don't think we should run from pedestrian issues and these other issues that were in this plan because they're important to the city. And so I'm a little concerned that it's kind of, to me, kind of a morphic thing that in March we'll start looking at this and we'll figure out what people want to do as opposed to showing some leadership, staff, and council as to these are some priorities we have. So I have to say I'm not sure I'm totally satisfied with what is being proposed here tonight.
If I could,
Wow. What?
Well, let's
Sorry.
let's give Paul a chance to respond, and then we'll go back.
Sure. So there is a balance of ideas here. One, there is an understanding that projects in the commercial corridors are important for investing in the city's future. And so the comprehensive plan, as it's being drafted up, would call for a proactive set of projects in the commercial corridors. And it would be the residential corridors where the more responsive approach to this neighborhood conservation is applied. So, for example, the small area plans lay out descriptions of what the streets ought to be looking like in those commercial areas. They're almost complete for the Washington Street corridor. The comp plan would call those out and say these need to be worked on in so many years and completed.
So I don't recall seeing in the or the area plan actually sections for the streets. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't recall seeing sections that said this is the sidewalk width we want to have, this is the tree planter width, this is the crosswalk, where we want to have. I don't recall seeing that. Is that in that document?
So what I'm basing that on, if you look at the South Washington Street plan, you'll see visuals of what the area could look like. And certainly there are examples of what interim street improvements might look like. And those can be turned into CIP projects pretty quickly.
I guess I'd like us to move forward on some of these concepts. I think there's some things that people don't want to go forward on, and parking and things like that, or taking away parking, clearly one of them. But I think that things like the commercial area you just mentioned are important. And so to me, I think we need to come up with some streetscape standards that are actually not kind of a general streetscape, but if very particular, so that we can decide this is what we want as a community, and maybe present those to council coming up here as to what your proposal of what a streetscape should look like. And then we can start moving towards implementing these. But, and other things. I guess I'd like to keep this moving forward. I don't want it to be kind of shelved. I know it's been shelved, and I know why it's been shelved. I understand that. It's been something that there's been a lot of other pressing priorities. But I think that it is important to deal with these issues. How we deal with them maybe to be determined. But I would like this to kind of come back to us on a regular basis with what your proposal is for how we're going to get on, the commercial areas for streetscape, crosswalks. I think I've seen the new crosswalks that are going in just across the street, and they seem quite nice. But it'd be great to start having a plan for crosswalks on all our lighted intersections, so people can go all four ways. A lot of them, they just have a crosswalk on two sides. Things like that, I think, would be good as sort of a long-term vision of what we want to see here. But anyway, thank you.
Other council members? Barry?
I am almost speechless, but not. Because the reason it was shelved, Dave, was because you, among other council members, absolutely beated a retreat when this was brought before council. So on the one hand, thank you for some of the stuff you're saying, but on the other hand, the reason that the committee was kicked to the curb and this whole thing was canceled is because you and other council members retreated like sons of guns from this entire thing. You absolutely abandoned this committee. You kicked them to the curb, your 14-foot or 20-foot curb, depending, with the planters or not. And so I'm finding myself thinking, I cannot believe I'm hearing, on the one hand, you're saying all the right things now, Dave, but this thing has been foundering because staff had to figure out how can we bring an integrated plan about how to move people through the city back to the council without getting council kicking them in the teeth. So I find your behavior just unbelievably disingenuous.
Well,
I find what you are saying unbelievably, disingenuous. I can't
Joanna,
believe. No, just don't even. You were on the committee, and you kicked them to the curb,
let me-
and
Joe,
now
I'm gonna
you're
step-
saying,
I'm-
"Oh
I'm
my
gonna-
gosh,
I'm gonna
it's such a
step
great."
in.
No, I'd like to
Yeah,
respond.
but let me.
If I could just respond, Joanne, I wasn't even on council when you all voted on this matter.
You were on the committee.
I was on the committee. I removed myself from the committee when I went on council. But when the vote occurred, I was not on this body at that time.
That's
but
correct.
I would say this: in general, the council as a whole decided that this was not a priority when there were other things going on. At this time, from what we just heard, I think it's appropriate to get back into it. To get back in the same way, maybe not. It doesn't sound like it, and I'm okay with that. But I think these are issues that are important. Everybody was gun shy when this all came back to the council. Again, before I was on, but I came on afterwards. And did I come and say, let's revive this thing? No, I didn't. But I think pedestrian issues are important, and I think that now is the time, in a different fashion, a different component, to get back into it. So I don't think it's disingenuous. Again, I wasn't even on this council when the vote was taken to get rid of the parking and to basically shelve this thing. So it's an important issue to me, and I think it's something we shouldn't let go on the back burner. And so I disagree with what you just said strongly.
Well, you may disagree with what I just said, but I'm telling you what, when it all came down, there was no support on council. You were part of that committee. You walked away. I'm telling you, you did. And the reason we are coming back with this piecemeal, and I think it's actually appropriate that we are coming back with things that work, is because this previous council, and you were on it, was so opposed to anybody coming anywhere near anybody's rose bushes. It was all of a sudden, it was considered an assault on the neighborhoods to even think about reconsidering sidewalks, reconsidering modes through the city. Look, I don't want to go any further than that because we're coming to the end here, and I'm delighted that this is coming back to council. But I gotta call you out, Dave. I gotta call you out because all of a sudden we got a whole new
Let's just take
change of
stock
attitude.
of where we're at this point. So, there was a previous vote taken about what to do with the PED plan. There was certain qualifiers put forward, two that I recall, one on parking and then one on right-of-way issues that were specifically called out for, which were any policy direction forthcoming wouldn't go there. So I think what we're trying to deal with now is try to keep the best aspects of, call it the PED plan, call it a pedestrian plan, call it what we may, is trying to come up with a construct of moving this forward. So one option would be trying to bring forward a plan which did not get community support in part at the end of the day, or try to come up with a construct that moves projects forward. And I think that's what we're trying to grapple with. That doesn't mean we dislodge some of the conclusions in the PED plan. I'm certainly not hearing that, and I'm not hearing that from staff, nor discount the work that was done by the committee who brought this forward, but try to bring it forward in a way that, one, meets some of the key objectives that were set forward in the PED plan originally, without trying to, go through the entire process again and utilize more funds for consultants, et cetera, to bring it forward, but try to do it in-house the best we can, utilizing some of the tools we have. So if we can focus in on that, I think that would be helpful to, bring the discussion forward.
I'm supportive of that. I don't think it has to be in the PED plan form, but I think it's just to keep it moving.
So-
And there has been a lull and a lag,
So-
and I'm partly
So
to blame
Dave,
for that.
if I'm hearing you correctly, again, I want to try to keep this positive and not revisit history here. But one of the things I've heard, as far as the points being made by you, Dave, is that there needs to be a level of detail in what we put forward in the comp plans as this comes forward. Is that, am I paraphrasing that correctly?
I think to some degree it does, because if it's so amorphic, you don't really have a plan anymore. It's just an idea or a concept. And so, particularly as it relates to commercial areas, I think it's important that we have specific, just like we voted on a 20-foot sidewalk width. I think that's helpful, and I think the idea if we could have, for example, a street section of how we want our streets to look in the downtown, I think that would be helpful as well. Instead of getting a hodgepodge, for example, in front of Northgate, we have different style tree bioretention or tree pits. So we've got multiple styles throughout our city, and we're going to have, even based on the last 3 years, we've got multiple styles of tree pits and water retention. So I think it is important that we try to look at this. We're a small place, and I think it's important we look at it in that fashion. So I would like to see some detail on it, yes.
And I think staff can correct me if I'm wrong, but the area plans that we're working on essentially have a piece in there, a module for sort of pedestrian issues built within it. Some aren't completely built in yet. Some of our placeholders as we move forward. Am I remembering this correctly?
Yeah, that's correct. And there's more detail going into the small area plans with each iteration of this process. So the South Washington Street area plan did include a small implementation section in the back with specific actions that staff and government should be taking to realize the vision in that plan. City Center is going to have that to a greater extent. And I will plug while we're on here that there is a community meeting for that small area plan this Saturday in the community center beginning at 9 a.m. So that's an opportunity to see some real detail in city planning documents.
But the detail is intended for the commercial districts. What we found is when you go into detail for theoretical improvements in residential districts, that's not helpful. What we know from this experience, what we had on Saturday, is when you're talking about a real project and people can really visualize what you're talking about and understand the trade-offs, the pluses and the minuses, then you can get to a decision and move forward. But when it's all theoretical in the neighborhoods, we got bogged down into conflicts that were kind of irresolvable. And so that's why the focus would be, in terms of detailed planning, on the commercial districts.
Right. And I think one piece of this that was sort of abundantly clear is sort of the community outreach and how that transpires. And I think the sidewalks that Wyatt's alluding to were generally positive as far as the public process, and the block meetings that we had. I believe they were, call them block meetings, but I think that was some of the feedback that we got on that was positive. Dave, does that sort of address the points you were trying to make? Okay. Vice Mayor Snyder, do you have anything?
I know you're on a time clock on this. I wanted to make sure we heard from staff about the meeting on Saturday, because I was able to attend, and I'm curious what impressions they came away with. Sort of the first step in this process is it's going to work in the residential neighborhoods.
Well, let's see. Let's see if Vice Mayor Snyder has
Okay,
anything
I just
before we
wanted
jump
to
into the
make sure we
details.
don't.
I really don't. At this point, I'll probably have like 1 minute of comments afterwards, so I know people are waiting to get to other agenda items, so I'll turn it back over to you for answering Councilmember Duncan's
Okay.
question.
This project is worthy of a much longer discussion, but we respect the fact that we have a full agenda tonight. And so if I could ask Paul to give just a briefing on what we presented and what we heard.
Sure. Overall, I think the meeting was a very positive experience for staff and the residents that came out. Staff provided the mock-ups that are here on the walls over on that side of the room, Roosevelt Street. On this side of the room, Northwest Street. Northwest Street had a couple of options that residents could look at. Roosevelt had really one design that staff was trying to move forward. And residents were able to come and talk. There was an open house format. They could ask questions in a casual atmosphere. And then there was a more formal sort of presentation piece with some back and forth between the residents and the staff about what was going on. And overall, I think, like Wyatt said, it was a good dialogue that staff, based on previous experiences and projects, tried to put forward options that staff expected residents to be residents to like, and residents had a chance to see sort of what are the impacts of these projects and what features do we want, which ones do we not want, which ones do we think are more important than others.
So in terms of conclusions, though.
Oh, sure.
The punchline.
We you know, the next step in the process, we'll go to the Planning Commission with 2232 approvals. Roosevelt Street seems to be full steam ahead. Let's get her done. West Street, option 1 at the top is a sidewalk along the entire western side of the street. Much more significant impacts in terms of tree removals, in terms of loss of parking. Option 2 below is much more sort of focused on getting people safely across West Street so they can access Highland or access Oak. What we heard, somewhat surprisingly, was desire for that sidewalk on the west side of the street, despite the impacts. And now, we do need to sort of go back to our mission statement. We got a grant for about $300,000 to improve mobility to Mount Daniel School. In terms of what we can get done with that amount of money, it really is these intersection improvements. And it's very hard to sort of take a small bite on the sidewalks thing and just do a little bit of it. You'd really want to do sort of a comprehensive sidewalk project, which we do not have the funds in this grant to get done. So we're digesting the public comments. The way our staff discussion after getting these public comments, despite the fact that there was strong support expressed for the sidewalk on the west side of the street, that we still need to keep within our mission statement and our grant application and focus on those intersections at Oak and Highland and try to do some bump outs to improve mobility across the street, but not do a linear sidewalk at the present time due to a lack of funding and due to the fact that our principal effort in terms of limited staff bandwidth is on the commercial sectors. We have some big grants to administer on Washington Street, and we really believe that that is where the investment in terms of a larger project, bigger impact needs to be with grant funds that have deadlines associated with them. So that's initial feedback on what we heard and where we believe we need to go forward on this.
So in terms of process, the folks who were here on Saturday, and there was a good crowd, there were 20 plus, actual civilians, plus staff who had to be here, who did a very good job too, I agree. The format seemed good, the time for the meeting seemed good, the nature of the discussion, some formal, some informal, was good. At any rate, after it was over, naturally, since I was there, several people came up to me, okay, what do we do next? Who do we go to? Because, as the manager said, there was a sense that, the full sidewalk, too much, too expensive, too many trees, but Plan B is maybe a little too light. Not enough places for kids to stand to catch the bus in a protected way, crosswalks that need to be a little more visible, et cetera. So their question was, where do we go next? And the answer to that is Planning Commission. Is that where we go next?
Planning Commission on December 16th.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
And I would like to add that staff is absorbing those comments, like you said, one's too light, one's too much, and we're looking at maybe there's a little bit something in between, but it still sticks to the mission and within our budget. So it might be slightly different, but it's going to look mostly like option 2.
Well, it's as you say, a resources question. I mean, I put it to several of the people who felt most strongly. I said, you know, sure, another $400,000 will get you most of what you want probably. How you feeling about that? And that is the kind of discussion that needs to be had at a community level so people understand that, you know, this is where your tax money would go if we chose to spend it on this as opposed to something else.
Right, anything else on this before we move forward?
Just very quickly, I'd like to thank staff for the work and for all the input. And however people feel about the former plan, good or bad, the reality is I think we're united in seeing that the city become more pedestrian and bike friendly, and I think we're moving in that direction in a significant way. So I'd like to thank everyone for the work here.
All right. On to the next topic, which is the stormwater ordinance.
And Jason Whitstrom is going to join us here at the table.
And council, just to help frame some of this, I had a good conversation as I was driving in to the council meeting with the manager about how to think about these issues, and also for the benefit of the council member elects who will possibly be handling this as well, depending on the timing of this, because this is a very complicated issue and has multiple moving dimensions to it. So I've asked Mr. Shields to focus sort of on the main policy objectives and the trade-off. So with that in mind, why do you want to go ahead and do the staff presentation?
Okay, and I will jump straight to page 6 and line 203 with some of the policy concerns for consideration. Council referred this out to boards and commissions many months ago, so this has been out in the community. It is complex, and we can have long and detailed discussions about phosphorus loads and water quality and what we're trying to accomplish with this ordinance. But I think a couple of key things for the council to have in mind as you're considering next steps on this ordinance. At line 204, one of the key recommendations of this ordinance is to adopt the 0.41 pounds of phosphorus per year for all single-family development. And that is, currently the standard is 1.5 pounds. So it's a far stricter standard that we're treating for and has more impacts as homeowners are developing their properties. Now, under the state law, it is the city could exempt all single-family homes from this standard, and we're recommending that the standard apply during major redevelopment of those lots. So that's one key issue. A second key issue is the grandfathering date. The state code standard is July 1st, 2014. Of when the law goes into effect. We can go earlier than that. Some of our boards and commissions recommended January 1st, 2014 as the date. And lastly, and this is one where a lot of our boards and commissions have commented on, and this is whether we keep the 35% hard cap in the ordinance. And VPIS has weighed in on this, the Planning Commission has weighed in on this, and other boards and commissions. In the staff report, we've laid out some responses to the pros and cons of keeping a 35% impervious cap in the R1A and R1B districts. In the staff report, I added some points just from my visibility on this and seeing how we administer this code. That moving the hard cap, the impervious hard cap, which is intrinsically a water quality measure, and moving it out of a water quality context and over to a zoning context has implications that need to be thoroughly thought through. And one of them is that right now, in terms of when we calculate impervious coverage, we do that for major projects, when you're disturbing 2,500 square feet of soil. If it's moved over to the zoning ordinance, the trigger for when we consider impervious coverage isn't there. So it presumably would apply if you were coming in for a very small or minor permit and would need to be administered. And so it's a major change in how we would do business. And I don't think that all those implications have been thoroughly thought through. On the other hand, some of the commenters on the ordinance do say that one of the good things about having that 35% hard cap is it's very visible. People understand it a little bit more readily than some of the BMPs that are called for in the ordinance. Make the case for keeping it in. But I just want to highlight for the council that it is, by moving it to the district regulations for R1A and R1B, that is a major change of how we do business and how we administer building permits in the city, and I don't think those have been thoroughly thought through. I note also that the definitions of what we would count as impervious or pervious in the zoning ordinance that's been proposed here were rather hastily drawn up, and I don't think those definitions have been thoroughly thought through either. They're contradicted in other parts of the code, and there's the potential for causing some confusion there. So I think those are some of the key issues as we go through, and I think it would be beneficial for you to hear from Jason on sort of a broader overview of the ordinance and where we are on it, but I just wanted council to be mindful of those policy discussions that we anticipate that you'll have and consider as this moves forward.
Okay. I'm going to try to summarize that, if I can, into
Okay.
3 key decision points. One is, should the 0.14 pounds of phosphorus apply to single-family homes? That would be decision point 1, because the state code lets us have some wiggle room. Not having it apply, as I understand it, means we're going to end up paying on the downstream effects. So you pay for it one way or the other. But the question is, do you have single-family homes pick up some of that cost? 2 is the 35% hard cap. Keep it or not, and if we keep it, where does it go, given what Wyatt laid out about sort of this oddity if we keep it in the zoning code, that if you pull a small permit to add a shed, then you could have a problem and not have any flexibility. So those are the 3 decision points, and then Wyatt also kind of caveated that there may need to be further public discourse on those 3 issues before we move forward. So I think those are the keys that I've sort of distilled down based on what I've read and what Wyatt described. Does that make sense to everybody? Am I getting this somewhat correct?
I guess, Mr. Mayor, I have a threshold question, which is the 35% was originally at least put in part to control stormwater. So explain why, as a scientific matter, we have to go with this different standard. And if we do, and we apply both, aren't we hitting single-family homeowners twice? You not only, if you do anything, you have to put a BMP in, but you've also got the 35%. So one of the things that I think for the community to be able to inform us and to discuss this, we have to know what are examples of impacts going to be on the homeowner.
Mm-hmm. Well, let
Why
me
don't
give
we go back to the fundamental question,
Right.
which what is the target in terms of stormwater, quantity and quality? Why doesn't the 35% do that? Why are we going to this new, tougher standard? And what's the cost-benefit analysis behind that?
Okay.
Is that okay? I mean,
Yeah.
there's a fundamental question here, which is we're proposing a major change.
Right.
Why? And is this the most cost-beneficial way to do it?
Well, I think that, in terms of state policy, the reason that the state is mandating greater reductions of pollutant load is because the Chesapeake Bay has a long ways to go, and that's the state policy that we're carrying out here at the local level.
And I think part of this, Dave, if I may, to try to address your question, I think it's a bit of a Venn diagram that I think we've all sort of done it, and they're interrelated issues. One is the storm water runoff issue, which I think we try to address with 35% impervious surface. And then you also have the water quality issues as well, which is some of the state mandates that we're getting. Now, that doesn't mean that they're distinct issues. They're sort of overlapping in places and different in areas. So I think that may, I don't know if that's helpful, but there's a connection between the two, but how much the connection is sort of vague, because they talk about two different types of things.
But let me say one thing, and I'm going to let Jason answer the question, because he can answer it better than I can. But the 35% is a proxy for 1.5 pounds of phosphorus. And so that's how 35% was arrived, and that was an old state standard. So the state standard has become more strict, but they've also done away with the proxy. Now they're saying, just let's go straight to talk about phosphorus load, because that's our marker pollutant, and we're no longer characterizing it as an impervious coverage percentage. And so that's the change and the shift in terms of the way the state is administering its efforts to reduce pollution.
So as a matter of policy, the state has decided to go for a different standard.
Yes.
If we do what some folks asked us to do, which is to keep the 35%, we're not only adopting the more stringent state standard, which will have a cost on homeowners when they do X, Y, and Z, but we're also maintaining the 35%. So what's the synergistic effect on a homeowner that has to comply with both of these? That's a question I have. And again, this is the kind of thing people will ask. How does it impact me?
And I think that it does have an impact on homeowners. There's no question about that. But I don't want to overstate it either. It's not very frequently that homeowners get above that 35% hard cap currently. I mean, the number of applications where that occurs, you can count on one hand. But nonetheless, in terms of administration, what we're going to is a new standard that is stricter. It is more than twice as strict as the current standard is. But it allows for the homeowner to treat their runoff, and it's no longer a question of impervious coverage. It's a question of treating their runoffs.
So, thanks, but I think this is a fundamental question, so I think it's probably worthwhile to spend a little time at it. So, the state has made a determination, theoretically, that because they're silent on the 35%, that they think that the problem that we're trying to deal with, the Chesapeake Bay issues, can be addressed with this new standard, right? And so theoretically, they would allow more impervious surface as long as you do these BMPs, right? So we're saying you not only have to do the BMPs, but you've got the 35% cover, which we may decide to do or not do. But you see, it seems to me the impact on the homeowner could be much more severe than just the one. Because you're not only controlling future development, but you're also controlling current status. So it seems to me there's a fundamental policy determination here. Do we really need to do both? And if so, why? What's the cost to the homeowner that's going to have to comply with that? And I guess one other question, since this is such an increase in stringency in terms of the standard, what are other jurisdictions doing? Are they all moving in the same direction? Are we required to do this? Do we have the option to keep our 35% versus change to this new standard? Or are we required to make the change in the new standard, to the new standard? And if so, when?
So we are required to adopt some resemblance of this ordinance by April. And it does allow, the state does allow on residential structures a exemption for single-family homes. Our surrounding jurisdictions are also mulling this over right about now as well. In talking with them, Fairfax County looks like they'll probably exempt, or they're talking about that, but the more urban, like Arlington and Alexandria, are kind of looking at this is a way that we can get more phosphorus removal. The reason kind of for that and why I outline this is with our 35%, that's a surrogate for phosphorus of 1.4 or 1.5 pounds per acre per year is the surrogate. And so by shifting it down to 0.41, that's what the state's standard is going to be. each development that we allow to go over 0.41 increases the amount of phosphorus in our streams, which means more phosphorus for us to remove through our CIP type projects. We estimate that about an acre is a pound, and that is roughly $120,000 to, yes, $120,000 for us to remove 1 pound of phosphorus. So this is kind of getting the low-hanging fruit, as we would like to think. This ordinance, that number, is kind of one of the legs of a stool that the state has put out there to get towards the compliance with the Chesapeake Bay mandate from the EPA. So we have an ordinance, we have the TMDL that we're getting, and then the state also has their own piece for VDOT and so on. The implications of this is it's not dissimilar to what the counties and cities that are directly on the Chesapeake Bay right now. They've had 16% as an impervious cover mandated to them since the 90s. And they've been allowed to develop over those percentages, but then they have to use some sort of BMP to get that back to the 0.41 standard, roughly. The cost of which is roughly $7,000 to $10,000. And it really is site specific and what type of BMP that you're trying to use. Some of the practices have been around since that time, so they're not really new. There's a clearinghouse set up to help people figure out what's the best option for them, and the state is running that aspect. I'm not sure if that answers all your questions.
Mr. Kayla?
Thank you. You're in the tricky part of figuring out distributional effects of different ways of charging. Okay, how's that? Okay. And I don't know that there's an easy answer to this. It's a tough question, because on one hand, if you do the 0.41 and get rid of the impervious surface, you don't have to track the accretion of impervious surface over years and different owners and so forth like that. It's a single measure, and it avoids that type of monitoring when you do it for new develop. Yes, we all have to pay at the end of the day, but is it less expensive overall for the new developments to pick up those costs as opposed to not doing it, and then all of the citizens having to pay an amount that ends up to be larger than it would be for the individuals? I don't know actually the answer to that, but it's probably worth somewhat more investigation. But these are the major distributional impacts, and when you get this level of shared service, it is difficult.
Other council members? Mr. Duncan?
Excuse me. I wanted to ask what you think our role can be in resolving the two kind of arguments that you present within the document. So on line 324, you say BMP's good thing. Department of Public Works well staffed, trained, and equipped to handle the additional demand expected from passage of this ordinance. And then the language that you helpfully provided, line about 250, where you say that one of the reasons that folks in the community, some folks, are advocating for the 35% to retain is a concern that, as the ordinance is currently drafted, there's concerns about the effectiveness, tracking, and enforcement of these facilities. So what I hear is we believe we do a pretty good job, and we're going to be able to do more with the utility staff that we're hiring. And there are folks in the community who don't share that view. So that's a management challenge, but it's also a council challenge too, I guess. Is there anything we could do to get us more towards line 325 than line 250?
I would say that right now for our BMP inspection program, we are required to do that at least once every 5 years. In development of the utility, we said that we would try to do those once a year, and that's some of the staffing that, levels that you saw to do that, to address, I think, a concern that if these practices aren't inspected, that they fail. They don't do what they're supposed to do. If people buy a house that has one, then they don't know maintenance procedures. That would be a concern, and then they're not functioning. I think that the point that was trying to be made by, I believe it was VPIS in this case, is that if you have a system that has less moving parts, then it's less likely to fail. So if you don't have a structural practice all over the place, then you don't have to really worry about it, that it gets handled some other way. By doing this ordinance, you would have structural practices everywhere, and you're relying on that maintenance aspect, where there could be some enforcement actions needed and a lot of time spent. I will say that this is one of the areas why Fairfax County is also considering exempting single-family homes, is the potential that they would have a numerous amount of BMPs to go out and inspect on a 5-year cycle. So,
Okay, well, that's helpful. I'm not sure what I think about that, but thanks for the answer.
Other council members? So again, I think the questions still remain on the three issues that I pointed out. To Vice Mayor Snyder's point, I think the second issue that I identified, which was the third, what to do about the 35% hard cap, keep it or not. Clearly, if we do keep that, that increases potential cost to homeowners and reduces some flexibility. Because under just having the phosphorus loads, you can mitigate some of the environmental issues by best quality management practices, which you wouldn't do if you keep the 35% cap. And I think the question that Vice Mayor Dave Snyder has is how would that affect homeowners? And I don't think we have the answer to that. And then third is assuming we would keep the cap, where you place it could also have an impact based on the type of permit that's being pulled. So, which could make it even more difficult for homeowners depending on where the placement of that is. But that's assuming that we would keep the cap, which I don't think we've vetted on or decided.
The grandfather clause.
Then there's the grandfather clause.
I would actually wanted to ask about, could I just piggyback one couple other things? Line 108, so we say that $7,000 to $10,000 is the cost to install, but if we exempted our homes, that cost would not apply. So is that right?
that's correct.
Okay, so you were suggesting maybe Fairfax is gonna exempt, so we'd be at a $7,000 to $10,000 disadvantage relative to the same kind of property in Fairfax, but we would be more comparable to the urban jurisdictions, Arlington and such. Is that?
Well, they'd still have to spend money to remove the additional phosphorus. They would be.
Okay, so it's not that big.
They may not pay it
All
up
right.
front.
Yeah, you were going to talk about grandfathering. Remind me the effective date of the split lot ordinance. When did we put that to?
I believe July 30th, 2014.
July 2014.
Let
okay.
me confirm that. but
Okay,
that's
so
my
this just happens to track along the same time frame as that, right? The way you propose it. Okay, and then the credit policy was my other question.
Yeah, the credit policy is still in draft form. We hope to have perhaps the last meeting tomorrow night. The way it's shaping up right now, and there is a split idea about this though, is that existing facilities, BMP facilities, would get credit for quantity and quality if they have those types of function to them. So there are opportunities for single-family homeowners to have a best management practice on their site in the future as part of a requirement like this ordinance and get credit off the utility fee for those. We've done an analysis right now, and it's roughly about $30,000 is if everybody who has a BMP right now applied for that credit. We have $100,000 set aside for that in the first year, but maximum would be 30. So we'd look to see how that impacts as it goes on in time. But then again, The group was split about whether or not existing facilities and even future facilities should get a discount if they're a part of a requirement as part of the development. The state law does say if you have a practice that you have to get some form of credit. So the credit task force thought maybe an idea would be to give them a very small, minimal 2-5%, something kind of arbitrary just for having one. But again, they were split right down the middle on that issue, and you'll hear more from the credit group as time goes on.
Ira?
Since I'm on the, I'm representing or attending for the council, Jason's completely accurate. There's a split. One of the issues isn't so much the individual homeowners, but for some of the, well, part of the area of new development, and if it's commercial, that's more obligatory. But there's some surfaces that people have taken care of in previous efforts and maintain that what they did in 1999 should be accounted because it was more than was required at that point in 1999. So you're going to end up with pretty subjective views about how far back you go and exactly what do you account. And these are the bigger impervious surface lots. So it is being discussed. I am more concerned personally that the ability to make judgments about what's an eligible retroactive credit is more tedious and more problematic than the potential rewards to the individuals because of the number of new, is it 1999, is it 1998, is it 1975? And then you get to argue because it's sort of, once you make the first exception, it's very difficult to pick a point where it stops. And that's the administration of that becomes more subjective and opens up staff to a lot of tough discussions with individual owners. Thank you.
Other council members?
Let me ask if there is, if we don't have a 35% coverage or maximum impervious area, is there anywhere else in the ordinance, either the zoning ordinance or anywhere else in code, that sets a restriction on the amount of cover or coverage that you can have on a lot, other than the setbacks themselves?
Well, there's a 25% building coverage rule, and so that's ancient in our zoning ordinance, and the administration of that's very clear. So that's the way it is right now. And so if you look at the, what the Planning Commission recommended to the council is that here at the end of your staff report at line 3930, actually go down the page to 3956. In that same code section where building coverage is at 25%, they would add an impervious lot coverage of 35%.
This would be the zoning ordinance.
That's correct.
And is that a sought amendment during this process now, or is that for another day?
Well, that is, the Planning Commission's recommendation is that these be adopted simultaneously. So that, while the Chesapeake Bay provisions that are currently in the zoning ordinance, but they're specific to stormwater and they're specific to the Chesapeake Bay, are being pulled out and moved into a separate section, then the zoning ordinance be amended to add the 35% to move it to the zoning ordinance as a standalone zoning provision.
So what this would mean is your footprint of your house could basically max out at 25%, and your driveway or whatever else you might put on there, a secondary building, accessory building, et cetera, would be another 10%.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Thank you.
In talking with Jim Snyder about this, he's coming from Arlington. They do have a impervious cap, and it's based on the zoning density, and it's a sliding scale. And there's opportunities in that, as Jim would say, to promote different types of development on those lots. by giving, say, a credit for a detached garage or a porch on the front of the property. So you could get a little bit more creative with your design other than, I have a lot, I have a 25%, how do I best fill that with a giant square? So he seemed very excited about the potential of having something like this, so just like other jurisdictions. But
And that's what I think, we still have opportunity to have that discussion. One that is really trying to more directly deal with density and land use patterns, as opposed to taking what is intrinsically a stormwater measure and then taking it out of its context and moving it over to zoning. That's really the fundamental of the basis behind my recommendation, that we set that aside for right now and do some more work on it. But still move forward with the state mandated stormwater provisions.
So it wouldn't be this then.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be the ordinance that we're have
That's right.
before us right now. All right. So in the effort to try to keep to somewhat of a schedule tonight, I think this was advertised for Monday. Is that right? So what I would propose that we do is at least hold a public hearing, but defer it based on the comments we get back and some of the questions that came up tonight. Would that make sense? Or are we ready to act on Monday?
And Mayor, if I might, I don't know if a third option could be move the stormwater forward and act on the Chapter 48 35% piece separately, knowing you'd be addressing stormwater, but you might have that gap of the cap until you did the second action.
But we're not
Okay.
going to finally adopt it until the credit policy is integrated into it, right? I mean, that's a question.
it's kind of a separate matter, but it does have some overlap. Credit policy is more about how much you're going to pay on your utility,
Yeah,
and what you can get back.
I-
This
I understand.
is more
I
how
don't know.
you'd redevelop your lot.
My preference for the optics would be to do both at the same time. Which I think is what you were suggesting. Well,
I mean, I wasn't thinking along the lines.
he wasn't
but-
thinking along that.
But I mean, I'll put that option out. One option is, I mean, again, this goes back to what we were talking about before. It's somewhat two separate issues that have overlap. One is sort of on the stormwater utility, which is the credit policy, which has stormwater implications and then also has water quality implications, and the credits certainly have a part to play in those. So one option the council can certainly do is have an omnibus session on stormwater and both quality and runoff issues and try to bring it together in a collective. That certainly could be one option, which I think, Mr. Duncan, that's what you're proposing. Other council members? Mr. Kelly?
Quick clarification. I think you were alluding to this, Jason, that the credit policy in terms of single-family homes is unlikely to move the needle, so it's not going to ameliorate that much. The differences between the two. The bigger differences are in the commercial development and in the larger impervious surface lots.
How far are we from the from the commercial and the residential from coming forward at this point?
On the credit policy?
The way that it's drawn up, it's really the stormwater pollution prevention plan, which represents 10% of a credit. The 30% for quantity and 30% for quality are the same on residential and commercial.
So I think the question is when is that going to come forward to the full council?
So we hope to have by the end of this calendar year a draft, well, pretty much a draft report for you to review as what could be the credit policy to hand out.
Other members of council? Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Berry.
I understand we had an April 2014 hard stop on what decision that had to be made?
The other components of the ordinance that we haven't talked about, like, for example, the Virginia State management permit that we have to do. It's currently a permit that the state administers. It's for any development over 1 acre. They have to get this permit with the state right now. Starting July 1, that responsibility will come to us. It's very similar to the review that we do now for, say, site plans and erosion and sediment control and stormwater components of those. So the state requires us to adopt an ordinance that has that language along with some of this redevelopment and development criteria in it, with the options to exempt and so on, by April to go into effect July 1.
Okay, I guess my point being that I agree with Mr. Kalin that the credit program does not move the needle considerably, and I think it's important, but I don't think it really materially affects the debate. Mr. Snyder has brought up some important points that I think need some arithmetic behind them, but I'm more concerned about federal mandates, state mandates, and that which we have to do to be compliant with a variety of legislative mandates. And so what I guess I would defer to staff about what decisions they need council to make in a timely fashion in order to comply with critical mandates.
Yeah, so April 1st is the hard deadline. And one thing I'll just say is, it's not ideal to have an ordinance coming to council with a difference of opinion on sort of a key issue like this. One thing that I will point out, however, is that under our existing code, the way that language reads and the way it's administered everywhere in Virginia is that 35% impervious coverage was meant to be anything above that is where you start treating your runoff. And that's the way that language is drafted, and that's the way it's administered across the state. In Falls Church, after the Planning Commission's had an appeal brought to it, and they made a determination that should be a hard cap, we've administered it that way. But that is unusual. That's not the way this is administered for stormwater and Virginia. And so if you set that Planning Commission determination aside, really what we're doing is going from a 35% standard to a far stricter standard, and that's a big step forward for water quality improvement. It's probably the environmental initiative of the year. And granted, it's state mandated, but it has major impacts on homeowners. This issue now of the 35% rule is sort of out there now as a policy question. Do we continue it on in some form or fashion? And I think that's really sort of the basic fundamental question for the council. Does the council wish to enshrine that now as has been proposed here in the zoning ordinance? And I'm simply noting that I think there are other implications to that we have not yet fully thought through if it's just in the zoning ordinance.
So here's how I see the options. Again, looking at the questions, I'm going to come back to them because I think at the end of the day we got to focus on these. One, and I'm going to slightly change how I framed it before. Should we utilize the phosphorus load to single-family homes? That's question one. Question two is, do we leave the 35% proxy in place? I think it's fair to say, and anybody can jump in, that even if we weren't going to do the phosphorus load piece, we would want to keep the 35% coverage in place as the proxy. I don't think anybody would want to slide from that. So I think that's sort of the minimum. Then the next question is, do we keep the 35% cap or not if we're going to go ahead and do the phosphorus load on single-family homes? And if we do decide to keep it, where do we want to go? Or where should it go in the code? And I think the question that Vice Mayor Snyder had is, what are some of the costs associated with trying to do the highest level, which would be the phosphorus, and then keeping the cap? Is that where you were going, Mr. Snyder?
Yeah, and perhaps other options, such as you keep the 35%, but for single-family homes, you grant the exemption from the one or the other. Do you see what I mean? In other words, you don't, if you could decide to exempt single-family homes, but maintain the 35%, or you could sweep in single-family homes for the phosphorus, but allow them some additional leeway on the 35%. Do you see what I mean? There's a combination of it's not necessarily, all the options weren't quite laid out. So I think we need, to me, this is a difficult question that I would like the community to have more opportunity to weigh in on, when they have a better sense about what are the impacts really.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, since the city has the option to exempt single-family homes altogether, you would say instead of having single-family homes go to the stricter standard of 0.41 pounds of phosphorus, instead just keep single-family homes at a 35%, but keep it as a hard cap. Is that?
That's an approach.
Is that the additional option that you'd like to have on the table?
Yeah, just to see from a policy standpoint, how many different ways can we look at the trade-offs?
Which is the current regime, essentially.
Right, because otherwise we're, in essence, one of the environmental advocates was concerned that by removing the 35%, to put that back in now, we'd have to take another affirmative action. So I'm hearing from them concern with removing the 35%. I think the community needs to be more engaged in this. I'm just so that they understand what the options are and what the impacts are going to be.
But is it fair to say, just so we have some policy direction in this discussion, that we don't want to slide from what we're trying to do on the water quality issues? We still want to meet the state mandates, but what we're trying to get to is a place that we're not limiting too much on what can be done without providing some level of flexibility, and we're trying to gauge where that is. Is that sort of where we're trying to head? Ms. Berry?
I think so, but I don't know what community engagement, I understand Mr. Snyder's concern, but community engagement I don't think is relevant here, because I don't think you can negotiate your way as a community around this issue. I think there are some hard stops all the way down the line. So rather than community engagement, other than helping people understand, Chesapeake Bay mandates, et cetera, I think I agree with Mr. Snyder that let's be ingenious about how we guide the discussion and how we might meet those mandates. As the mayor says, we don't want to shy away from what I think has been our extraordinary participation as a community in terms of meeting and exceeding environmental standards. I think Falls Church has continued to be a leader in clean air and clean water, et cetera. So I think that's what the mayor is saying, is we don't want to step back from that. But I hope what Mr. Snyder is saying is, how can we be ingenious and flexible in meeting those standards? But I just want to make sure that this is not, unless I misunderstand, this is not something that's really open to a whole lot of community debate, because there is no debate. It's how do we get there, right?
And I think part of that, and Vice Mayor Snyder, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, is we don't want to run into the traps of unintended consequences. For example, we don't want to set the phosphorus loads, layer on top of that a 35% hard cap, and then find out all of a sudden we've read redevelopment out on major properties. And we don't know the answer to that tonight. I think we're all trying to be forward-leaning on the environmental issues, but we just need to make sure that some of the actions that we're prepared to take don't render redevelopment of properties impossible.
Okay.
And I'm just not confident we're quite there yet. The phosphorus loads, it sounds like even if we were to make them even, which I don't think we have the authority to do under state code, even more stringent, but with BMPs, you can sort of redevelop because you can do best practices, but the hard cap is a hard cap. So I just don't know how, if we layer both, what happens. I don't think we have the answer to that. And we're all, I think, trying to balance the environmental aspects, but not turn around and find out a year from now we have lots that can't be redeveloped because of the actions we took. And the sense is I don't think we have answers to that. Is that what you're trying to get at? Mr. Kaler?
Would it be possible, would it be possible to say, if no one did anything and we still have to meet the .41, how much would it cost in additional capital expenses? Have that corner solution of the most expensive solution possible. Then go to the other, which is you have the strictest possible. What that would look like in cost terms and vis-a-vis the ultimate cost of meeting the .41, and then somewhere get an idea in between what the mid-ground would look like for the individual homeowners, just to put something tangible around the discussion, so we have an idea what the cost structure might look like.
Do you mean between the .41 pounds of phosphorus per acre and some higher standard?
No, we can't do higher standards than what the state mandates.
Well, for single-family homes, we could.
We could? No, just the .1, just whatever the state mandates.
Okay.
That's what Jason said was if there was no requirement on if they were in fact exempt, it would mean
I see.
that that would all have to be picked up in the form of additional capital improvements.
I would say that
Don't have to answer it. I'd just like to
I
see the
know.
numbers.
in the development of the utility, we did not assume any numbers coming from redevelopment because we don't have a crystal ball to know how many would redevelop over. I mean, we could take a guess, maybe 20 houses a year, but that's a very small amount to have a real impact on the utility.
I understand that, but I'm talking about you give the individual the two corner solutions, and the answer will be somewhere in between. That's what I'm saying. So you have an idea of how stringent you might want to be, accepting that you can't predict how many people are going to want to redevelop, and understand that. But it's nice to know what the differences are, if there really is a big difference or it's a small difference. That's would be interesting to help perhaps the decision-making process along, but with no estimate of who's going to redevelop what areas and at what time.
So I think where we're at with this, thank you, Joanna, is we sort of know what the universe looks like right now with 35% cap because we've been operating under that for a little bit, right? So I think it's, at the next session we have a further discussion about that, but also having staff think about what would happen if we kept the 35% cap and also adopted the phosphorus load, what that would do to costs and ability to redevelop.
Well, but I would just, in terms of the standard that's in here, that has been pretty thoroughly vetted, because that's been out there for a long time, and we've gotten
The
lots of
35%.
No, the
The
.41, the strict standard, which is the real change. The 35% hard cap, I think, is the wild card because we do know how to administer that when you come in for a building permit for a major project and you're disturbing 2,500 square feet. What's different is we now administer that when you come in for a deck permit or a kitchen remodel potentially. That's what's new, and that is what I think is problematic.
But is that what the planning commission is proposing, is putting it in that section?
It's in the zoning ordinance, so you could have a complaint. My neighbor looks to me like he's over 35%. Then the building, we would presumably need to act on that complaint and find out if they're over 35%. If they are, there needs to possibly be some sanction. We haven't thought any of those things through. We're going to make people take out their patios. You don't even need a permit to put a patio in. So there are implications here, and I think the planning commission's view is better to start here and then maybe we relax it over time. I think that's a problem because on day one we need to administer it, and we don't know how to administer it.
Has that been discussed with the planning commission?
Well, they made clear, I think, for many months that they wanted to keep that standard in, and I think when they actually saw language, I think the discussion, my understanding, was quick. It was, okay, good, we kept the 35% hard cap in, that's what we wanted, and there was not a whole lot of discussion about it,
About the consequences of it?
about how that would be administered.
Okay. So perhaps we get some feedback from the planning commission about that before this comes back. I mean, I think what the manager is saying makes a lot of sense as far as administrative costs that could be associated with it if it goes in the zoning section, which was my point 3.
Right. So there's really a fork in the road. We can hold everything while we do that work, or you could move forward with the stormwater just to have that body of work done and have direction to staff and the planning commission to come back under a time certain, or we do we can go back and try to keep them all together, but that probably means that the whole thing would not be acted on until closer to that April time frame.
What do members think on that? Mr. Kale?
I think the advice from the Arkansas Traveler would be well heeded, which is when you run into a fork in the road, take it. I think this is obviously not ready to move right now. That's clear. It's still got too many loose ends into it. Need a little bit more certainty. And understandable. So I don't think pushing it before Christmas is going to make.
So Mr. Kelly, your suggestion would be keep it all together rather than having one piece of it go forward?
Probably better, because if there's unintended consequences, you want to consider them together. But that's not a hard view. That's
Other council members? Vice Mayor Snyder.
I favor having this on the agenda for Monday night, but not to take action. I think there's a lot of community discussion that has to occur on this, and exactly the kind of things that we're talking about, the trade-offs.
It's been noticed, so I think at minimum we're going to have a public hearing.
Yeah, and I would notice it for public hearing and not action, and then we'll work on some ways to illustrate this for the community so that they can see the impacts of the potential trade-offs. And it's not all a slam dunk. There are at least 3 questions which you outlined at the beginning that have some significance for our citizens. So it may well be that the distributional effects are such that you simply have to do it. It also seems like we're singling out single-family homes for particularly harsh treatment, which may not be the case. But if it's perceived as that way due to a lack of information, then that creates an unnecessary problem for moving forward. I think it's very, very important to try to understand the mandates, the options for resolving those mandates, and recognizing, too, that there's strong support for maintaining the 35%. I mean, there really is. So I'm not sure I'm ready to jettison that at this point based upon the comments that we've received from the environmental groups. But I don't know what the impact of this is going to be, frankly.
Right. Other council members? Ms. Berry and then
Yeah, and I don't, I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor, I don't think this is going to be helpful to you, but I represent a third opinion, which is that I don't like the idea of fractured, resolutions coming before council. I mean, in a perfect world, this would all be neatly tied up and would be integrated and would make sense.
I think that's what we've heard so far.
Yeah, that's
it's not a different opinion.
However,
Although there's a however.
there's a however, but I don't want I don't want to jeopardize our the city's requirements before mandated Chesapeake Bay regs. And so if the stormwater piece had to move forward, I'd like to see that happen. That being said, again, while I understand, I think I understand what the vice mayor is saying. it's absolutely fair and appropriate that the citizenry be apprised and aware and engaged in the various options, but I don't, and to understand it, but I don't think a lot of this is debatable. And I guess that's my point. I think people should be aware, and again, we should be ingenious about solutions, but I don't want to leave, I don't think, perhaps the city manager can correct me, but I don't think there's a lot of leeway here in terms of people voting, I'd rather this not happen, or I'd rather to see this happen. I think we are fairly boxed in as to what it is we have to do. We just have to be ingenious about how we move forward. So I guess I would say that, again, in a perfect world, I would like an integrated, comprehensive, coherent package going forward. But if push came to shove, I just want to make sure that our mandated requirements are met. That's all I want to say.
Ira?
I just want to support something that Ms. Barry said before regarding the role of public involvement and so forth. Clearly, it has to take place. No one's disputing that. And I think it's pretty clear that there's certain obligations that are not negotiable. Now, if it is not possible to come to some sort of idea of which is a preferred outcome, then okay, it'll be a free-for-all when it gets to the public opinion. But I think elected officials, while responsive to the needs of the public, also have a responsible for some leadership. And if there is a methodology that looks like it is the preferred, that people should stand up and say, we'll talk about it, we're glad to, but here's what we believe would be the basis, so that the discussion with the community is coherent and focused rather than a free-for-all of various groups trying to push their point and inviting that. So this is going to be an ongoing discussion, because there are a lot of talk now about taking things to the public, and this is going to clog up the schedule, and they're going to clog up the public's tolerance for meetings as well, if everything has to come for review without the council taking some position on what it thinks makes the most sense.
Okay, so on that note, I'm going to try to summarize where we're at and sort of what we're asking for. And I think there's consensus that this isn't ready to come forward, that we want to do it in a collective way, with the caveat that by the date certain where we have to have actions taken on the state mandates, that we do that. So that date cannot slide on the sections that deal with the state requirements. That was Ms. Barry's point. So on items that have flexibility, I think the goal is to have it done at the same time. So what I'm saying shouldn't be misinterpreted as let's just meet what we have to do in April and then let's not do the rest until sometime after April. I don't think anybody's saying that. And then as far as decision points, as far as what we're trying to engage in is, again, I'm just going to repeat the questions. The phosphorus load should apply to single-family homes and or keep the 35% cap. And then 4 or 3, if we decide to keep the cap, where it goes, and we'll call that the Wyatt section.
The Wyatt question.
The manager's implementation problem. The X. How about that? Council will take the first 2, Wyatt. You can take 3.
To build on what you're saying, maybe one of the components, I mentioned the numbers, but if it's really a toss-up, then it could be decided in terms of preference for the council, what it is that the management of the city can actually more easily and with easier justifications of the approach, what actually makes sense in terms of implementation. If it's not clear that one way or the other is beneficial, to take that component into the recommendation. X methodology would allow for the greatest perception of equitable distribution and ease of administration, if there's no clear benefit from one approach to the other.
Okay. Mr. Shields, Jason, does this give you guys enough?
Okay, but we obviously we'll keep the public hearing on for your next meeting, but we'll advertise it as item to be deferred.
Well, the motion would be a motion to defer.
Okay.
and we should, just so we keep some of the pressure on this and moving, if we can add a date certain to the motion to defer, so it stays on the calendar rather than doesn't come back.
Okay.
Also, one other question, which is a housing policy question. There are notions increasingly of building spaces for extended families on properties. This would appear to largely preempt that and prevent that, so I'd like a bit of a discussion on that policy as well.
I think that as this discussion goes forward, I think there are people who would comment in terms of what the 35% hard cap means in terms of how you use your property, because people have now been sort of working around it for about six months or a year, and so I think we have some experience on that. But in terms of other policy things down the road, it has an implication.
And I think that's very relevant. I recall a news press article a couple years ago about so-called flats for extended families, which increasingly may be a model that is relevant to maintain seniors in the property and to provide housing for kids that otherwise couldn't be done. So I think we need to be careful we're not inadvertently running against that policy if that's something that's considered to be a valuable policy.
Right.
On to the next item, which is the resolution for irrevocable elections not to participate in the Virginia Local Disability Program.
Okay.
Can we keep this to 5 minutes?
We can probably do it less than that. I do believe this is as close to a pro forma action by the city council as you might imagine. And it really affects our constitutional officers and specifically treasurer and commissioner. Currently, this is offered by VRS. The Virginia Municipal League and VOCO have banded together to provide a lower cost alternative. By opting out of VRS, it keeps her options open to go with a lower cost option. And again, this is for retirement under disability. Our police are not under this program. It's just the Constitution and the Treasurer, and we don't have anyone retired on long-term disability right now anyway. But by opting out, it allows us to keep our options open and go with a lower cost provider.
Any questions on that? Mr. Kelly?
Just to confirm, now the reason that they're requiring one or the other is that there's some sort of financial difference between the two?
Yes, there's a multiplier, and VRS's multiplier was higher. VML VACO offered a lower multiplier, and VRS, I think, is in the process of possibly lowering their cost to meet VML VACO, but at any rate, VML...
Seen a benefit?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So everybody ready for this to be on the calendar for Monday? Okay.
Sure.
All right. We are on to the General Assembly Ledge Program. So on this item, there's some issues here that touch upon the executive branch, et cetera, that are sort of embedded in this, and I've run into this before. So for the purposes of this meeting, until I have a chance to further talk to my office and also work with Cindy to see if there's a way of separating pieces out, I'm going to just prudentially recuse myself from this. Not that there's anything wrong if I were to participate, but I'd feel more comfortable not participating until some of this gets sorted out and pieces are possibly pulled out if we're able to do it. And I believe Mr. Snyder had one similar concern as well.
Okay, but only on one item, so why don't we go...
So I'm just going to have Mr. Snyder take this
Thank
at
you.
this point.
Excuse me, I need to get staff back into his office.
That's okay. It's multitasking. Very well done. Yeah, could you, let's hear a report on the proposed legislative program.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. And as council knows, Mr. Snyder and Mr. Duncan serve on the legislative committee. I've put together this proposal this evening with the attachments from all the boards and commissions and agencies that have submitted comments or ones that we traditionally track due to the regional nature. And then based on the input tonight, the Ledge Committee and I will wrap this up and bring it forward for council action next Monday. Based on the mayor's initial points and any other comments, we can separate the resolutions if need be. So, for example, the federal item I could do as a standalone resolution if council so directs. But I'd like to just highlight a few things and then get council's input for the Ledge program as we move forward. We do have some key timing issues because of the General Assembly's bill deadlines for pre-filing. So depending on which bills council wishes to pursue, we would need action by the 25th. So looking at lines 130, I thought I would just focus on the key points to call attention to a few items and then seek council's comments and input. Under priority, this is organized as we have traditionally done with priority items, regional, and then support. Anything in the council's legislative program, they're written broad so that as bills come up that may be a little more nuanced, I have the general council's direction in order to comment. The priority ones are the historic ones that we have pursued, and they were in your packet last year with the exception of the new charter amendment. And that's at line 131, and it's a separate resolution before you all this evening for the next item, which Mr. Foster is here to expand upon. That is one that requires a bill, and so it would need action by the 25th. Dangerous weapons and pedestrian crosswalks are ones that in the past council has done bills directly, or we've supported other bills, and so I need direction whether council wishes to try yet again to make a point in committee and in reality probably not get success, but we continue trying to push the needle forward. The line 175 is the second half of the funding that Delegate Scott pursued last year. He didn't get the full request, so in working with Delegate Simmons, he has agreed to put that forward if council still wishes to support our arts and culture for the remaining dollars. And then we have all the regional packages and supports from our electoral board, environmental, and library board that are here for your attention. The community net metering on line 203, which is the Environmental Services Council's legislative position, is one that I know a bill will be put in and is being supported by other localities, so we don't need to ask our delegation to sponsor, but it is in here to ask for council support. And then I would just note at line 213, I have noted, and it continues to the next page, on the request from Northern Virginia Move to Amend, and all the signatories are attached here. They've requested council support of a resolution regarding the Supreme Court's ruling on how corporate spending is done in state and federal legislation. And their draft resolution that's submitted to you starts at line 1480. That would require council action, and if it's supported herein, I would bring it as a separate action for resolution, and that is one, since it's the only federal item in this legislative program, we could separate out. With that, I wasn't going to go through any more detail on all of the positions. I put them in there so you could see them verbatim. And of course, regionally, there's a lot of issues on state funding for transportation and services as a whole.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions from council? Councilmember Berry?
Mr. Vice Mayor, I don't have a question, but I do want to support the move to amend request. I think it makes sense, just as a movement, and I also think the City of Falls Church, which is, I think, a city that is dedicated to very clear lines between the finance and good civic policy, should endorse the move to amend recommendation. So I just, I don't know if this is appropriate at this time, but I certainly want to throw my weight behind support of this amendment.
Okay, thanks. Yes, Councilmember Kalen?
A small point and then a larger one. Now, on line 275 regarding electoral board legislative goals, that 275, I don't know who drafted this, I'm just curious, but it says, serve as an honor which belittles the actual work. I don't think that's what was intended, belies or doesn't, yeah, I don't think, that's a sort of a strong.
That's the wrong word.
Yeah,
I can check with the electoral board. This is verbatim from their adopted document.
I mean, I could see why they want it, but that's pretty personal.
And you get a gold star for proving that you read everything, too.
Exactly. And I think you should note that in your comments that I found that. And I would also like, in a much more important issue, just to support what Ms. Barry said regarding the movement to amend. I think that is a critical issue that's had a profound impact on the governance in the United States.
And on the point of making sure no point is missed, I do want to acknowledge that I have misspelled our new delegate's last name, and I will correct it in the final version.
That would be a very good idea.
Indeed, it would.
Thank you.
Very politic,
Councilmember Duncan?
Far be it for me to criticize close proofreading. I'm not sure about 275. I think the point is that the small amount of money it's so small that it belittles the actual hard work entailed. I don't know. Cindy I'm not sure that's not the right word. At any rate,
I will verify.
please verify. And I would like to third the motion made by Mr. Berry and Ms. Berry and Mr. Kalen about the move to amend, and just note that several area jurisdictions at line 1602, more than 400 cities, towns, and counties across the country, including Charlottesville, County Board of Arlington, Council, Alexandria, have called for the amendment. So we are in good company.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? I'd like to make one generally about the transportation sections. While there are a lot of them, I think the most fundamental approach on transportation issues is not to open up the transportation funding bill that was enacted last session. As imperfect as it is, there's been a major effort to implement it. That effort has been sustained by the courts. To now open that up would run the high risk of delaying indefinitely important transportation projects and to really undercut the effort of everyone to get this thing moving to produce results. So I think that's a key point in all the transportation sections that hopefully isn't lost in the, if it's not clear, then we ought to make it clear in the materials. And then I would add that in prior years, we've allowed people to take separate votes if they want. It's purely up to whatever council members want to take separate votes on different sections if they want one pulled out and voted separately. That's a privilege we've always allowed. So any other questions or comments?
Just one. I
Councilmember
just
Duncan.
wanted to note, I'm sure Vice Mayor's noted that several people who've been involved in the Move to Amend effort here in the city are with us tonight, and would invite them to speak to us when this comes before the council and chambers and there's a public hearing. I think it'd be useful to hear some citizens talk to that issue to help anyone who might have questions understand it, because they're very articulate and informed on it.
Yes, for sure. Thanks. Any other questions or comments? Is it the agreement of council, then we'll move forward with this package for public hearing and potential decision on Monday.
So based on what I'm hearing, I will bring the legislative program together for adoption. For the federal, since there's favorable motion to do that, I will bring that as a separate resolution and be a separate vote and say that it would be separate from the state package. And then we will bring forward, based on your next discussion in more detail, the charter amendment for cleanup. So I'm anticipating at least 3 actions related to the legislative program.
Right, and listing as a priority somewhere, not opening up the transportation funding bill, if that's not in the priority list, if people are agreeable to that. And then, again, Monday night, if anyone would like a separate vote taken on any item, they can ask for that, and it'll be granted, I think, as a matter of
And if I
discretion.
know in advance, it's helpful just so we prepare the motion and resolution correctly.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you for chairing that section of the meeting. And as I've mentioned before, any of the items that deal with federal matters, and there may be others in there, Cindy. My name shouldn't be associated with it, just as a prudential matter. Again, not that it's a definitive issue, but best that I not partake. All right. The next item on the agenda is the resolution to seek a charter change dealing with when our organizational meetings are, both the school board and also the city council. Mr. Foster.
Good evening, council. As the mayor correctly summarized, there are 3 sections that are proposed for amendment as laid out in the staff report, sections 3.04, 4.05, and 20.02. These are really housekeeping amendments since all of these provisions were repealed by implication, as I advised you all in a memo of about a week ago. Nonetheless, their continued existence in the charter does create confusion, and I recommend that council adopt a resolution at its next meeting asking the General Assembly to make the amendments that are laid out here. Happy to answer any questions.
Council members, questions on this? Mr. Foster, does this sort of clean up all the sections as a result of the date change? I know that we had done a previous cleanup that obviously didn't clean up everything. I just want to make sure we're not revisiting anything next year.
Right. No, this should take care of it.
And I also suggest that we get feedback from the school board on this since it affects them as well. Mr. Tarr?
Question. So I'm just wondering if this language may be a bit too precise. For example, in section 4.05, it talks about, if January 1 falls on a Sunday, then we'll do it on that Monday. But that Monday, for example, could be a federal holiday, in which case maybe all the staff gets dragged in on a holiday, and I don't know if that's intended or not. But I wonder if it could say something more broad, like the first meeting, the first meeting of council in January, or something like that.
You could, here's the challenge that you face, is under the state code, you all and all elected officials in the city need to take the oath of office by January 1st. And so you can take it before January 1st, for example, at December 9th, like I think is going to be done this year. And so that's what I was wrestling with. I'll continue to give it some thought. I mean, this is just a initial draft, and if I can refine it, certainly circulate that prior to Monday's meeting.
Yeah, it just seems to me that maybe it would be better to say something like the first, meeting in January, as opposed to getting in a situation where, again, Monday's a federal holiday and it's a local holiday, yet we've got all staff people dragged in to come to a meeting, or we get 2 feet of snow on the ground and we're required to come on in. So that would be my thought. And then let me just ask you mechanically, so the new folks take their oath of office, let's say, what'd you say, December 9th?
Yes.
And so what happens to the old folks? So they, essentially, their term is expired as of January 9th, not January 1?
No. Their terms pursuant to state law, the existing council members will remain in office under state law through December 31st. And the new members officially begin their terms on January 1st. However, another provision of state law says basically that newly elected members can be sworn in, take the oath, in other words, prior to January 1st, but they don't actually begin their terms until
Gotcha.
January 1st.
Okay, that's what I was getting to. Thank you.
Sure.
Could I continue to ask how many angels can dance on the head of that pin? So, in other words, in the year just now coming up, it's going to be a fairly late first meeting, right? It's going to be, could be as late as January 7th, and it's going to be on January 6th, 2014, right? Because what Mr. Charter said, that if the holiday falls, well, this year, Monday's the 31st, Tuesday is the 1st, The bias that we're building in here is when the holiday is kind of in the middle of the week, we
Right.
basically are having a bias not to bring people back in the middle of that holiday week, rather they will come back on the first meeting in January. Now, the first meeting in January is a work session, right? So what about that? When you say first meeting, do you mean we have a special meeting to organize and elect leadership?
Well, that's certainly, I mean, there's different ways that you all can approach this.
I mean,
And
otherwise, the first meeting is January 14th,
Right.
13th,
And
right?
so, I mean, that's one of the problems. The other problem is, as you just identified, is depending on when the holiday is, I mean, it could be falling in the middle of the week. People could be having to come back from, being out of town on holiday vacations. And so to avoid all of that, another way to approach it would just be to, ditch.
Second week,
Yeah, second
Monday
Monday, right?
January.
Of January would be one way
Here's-
to approach it. Yeah, go ahead.
If I can just dive in.
Sure.
Sort of, Mr. Charter, to your point, I think the flexibility is good, but not having a date certain makes it even more like trying to manage calendars, which I occasionally have to do amongst 7 of you, and myself. It can be difficult, especially on a really important vote like that. So I think it's best to figure out a date certain and keep it. So if it's the second Monday of January, that may sort of resolve the holiday issue. But yet, place.
Actually, the second Monday of January could be late enough that it might bump into Martin Luther King Day. I'm not sure you ought to better move it down that far into the month. I mean, I'm just asking. I mean, is it possible, allowed for council to get together? I mean, we're all going to be here on January 6th. By that time, everybody's kids are back in school and so forth. Is there any reason that you cannot meet as a council and elect leadership and do whatever you do, rules of procedure and so forth, and then have a work session or whatever? I mean, is there any reason that you could not have a meeting?
Well, I think-
There's
I think-
no legal
yeah.
prohibition on doing it at a work session, if that's your question.
Okay.
So it would
There's
be
not.
It's
it would be
by
a regular meeting.
practice traditionally, in the city here, work sessions, typically votes are not taken.
Right.
Um,
But we are, with what you set up here, we are moving to probably a practice where we are going to swear people in before January 1st, like the school board has always done.
Right, and to be clear, if the city council decides that that's what it wants to do, it would be consistent with not only what the school board and the city has done, but what many other localities do, just to avoid having to, rush and do it on January 1st. They do it sometime in December.
Okay, well, I'm fine. I just wanted us to be clear on that question of can the council have an organizing meeting on the first Monday, even though that would normally be a first and third Monday would normally be a work session?
Yes.
And you're telling me we can do that, so that's fine.
Yeah, and that's what's happened anyways, right now, even under the current charter.
Yeah.
Which says July.
The only other question I had was under section 405, and I'm not necessarily going to get all this right, but there's some language in there about in the absence of the city clerk, the meeting may be called to order and the oath administered by any judicial officer, et cetera, et cetera. Are we retaining that language or are we eliminating that language?
Certainly, we could retain that language if council wishes to do so. Just for the sake of brevity, I did not include the entire section
Right.
of the charter. I just put the relevant language on.
Right, okay, that's what I assumed, that it's okay, we'll keep it in there, you just didn't feel like you needed to indicate it all. Okay. So, the takeaway here is the nights on the calendar that we mark are December 9th for the swearing in and January 6th for the comeback, basically.
But that's this year, so I also heard Mr. Tartar raising the question of possibly having it on the second Monday of January to eliminate issues in future years where it doesn't work out as well as it did this year, and you've got people coming in during the holiday.
No, all I want to do is build in some flexibility. I didn't necessarily prescribe any date.
No, I was suggesting prescribing a day to meet the flexibility of people traveling during
Sure.
the holiday, but yet people knowing when they need to be here without everybody scrambling to try to figure out when people's calendars match up and people are feeling like they're getting treated fairly. Because trying to get everybody in doesn't always work out that well.
A date like the first Monday after January 1st sounds a whole lot better than, July 1st, which is always the world's worst time to swear in because it was right before the 4th of July and it screwed up the whole week. So I think this is better. My mother-in-law reminds me that, yeah, somehow we always got the council sworn in.
John, can you give that some thought? I think you understand what we're trying to do. Maybe go out like 20 years on the calendar. See how it plays out. Mr. Kelly?
Well, how about a date certain no later than when we consider the stormwater management?
All right. So my preference on this is build in flexibility, but then have a date certain, so some poor person doesn't have to try to make sure everybody's there. All right. Does that work for everybody? Dave, does that work for you?
Yeah, sure. Let's see what come back with, but I just want to have a little flexibility.
So we do vote on this on Monday, because I'm just determined I'm going to buy the plane ticket at some point. I should wait till Monday, I guess.
Mr. Duncan, for the purposes of this year, I think we've all agreed that we're not going to try to do something that pulls people in on the first or whenever the date would be.
But
Unless,
please-
of course, there's a motion for reconsideration filed after the action is taken.
I do need you to vote on Monday so I can have it pre-filed for the General Assembly date.
Yeah. And if we need to make adjustments, we always can, right? After pre-filing?
Yes, after it's pre-filed, we can edit, but I need to get it into the docket.
And right now, we're looking in at the first meeting being January 6th. Is that the Monday? So, Mr. Shields, just on that point, if you can just poll all the members elect, make sure that works.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Foster, have you gotten feedback from the school board on what they're intending to do?
I have not.
Okay.
But certainly, I will discuss that with the chair.
If you can discuss that with the chair, hopefully you can then discuss it with us without breaching any confidences. Because that would be good for us to know what's happening, because if we're out of sync and we're not in agreement on the advice that you provided, I think we've got another problem. We've got another problem. So actually, that's not, it's all kidding aside. We don't, I mean, the school board has gotten the same advice we've gotten. I think it's important that we try to do the same thing on this front, or else we're going to have some misalignments going on, which would not be very good. So, and if we can make sure that they see this and know what we're doing, since it directly affects them as well. Okay. All right. We are on to my recent, most famous favorite topic, the alignment of the fiscal year and tax year.
Speaking of misalignments, so I've drafted up a memo that lays out basically what the issue is. Put succinctly, in the mid-1990s, the city chose to move its tax collection date back 1 month from July till June, and by so doing, created a misalignment in terms of when taxes are collected and when the council actually votes to approve a tax rate for the subsequent budget. And so what we've laid out here is a proposed fix. When the council made the change back in the mid-1990s, there was a one-time benefit of about $12 million to the city because we had 3 tax bill collections in one fiscal year. So that showed up on paper anyway as a financial benefit. To fix it, what would be required would be to simply state that our tax year for real estate begins July 1st and ends June 30th. And what that would do is that we typically make an assumption for the June billing of some amount of increase. And in the presentation that you saw on Thursday, we had a 1.5% assumption of increased assessed value that would apply to the June billing of 2015. If we took that assumption out and just held it flat, that would reduce the revenue forecast by about $400,000. That's a one-time correction that we would need to take care of if we were to make the tax year and the fiscal year aligned. Technically, in terms of how to do it, there's an example from the city of Manassas. It's pretty straightforward. You simply declare that for real estate, the tax year begins on July 1st and ends on June 30th. The reason to do that, the benefit to it is you get more certainty in your budgeting. Now, real estate, which is 60% of the city's revenues, would become virtually a certain figure. You know the assessed value and you know the tax rate when you adopt the budget. And so there really would not be any surpluses or deficits in real estate other than underpayment or possibly, if you had in one year some large appeals that perhaps changed the number a little bit. But those would all be in the range of pretty marginal changes relative to the pretty big swings that we experience right now. And so then the only other surpluses or deficits would just come from the remainder of our revenues. Local taxes, which is 25% of our revenues, or federal and state grants, which is 10% of our revenues. One implication of it is that currently we fund our pay-as-you-go budget through surpluses, largely which come about because of this misalignment of tax years. That's what builds up our fund balance, and then we spend that fund balance down over years through the CIP. And so if we were to adopt this measure and have more certainty in our revenues, those surpluses would go away, and we would need to actually, in a more planful way, allocate funds out of the tax rate to pay for pay-as-you-go capital. That's the other sort of implication that I think we would need to be fully aware of if we were to make that change. At the end of the memo, I do provide a recommendation that I think certainty is a good thing. I think it would help us be more planful. It would increase the, I think, the reliability of our forecasting significantly. I do suggest that we provide ourselves adequate time to make this adjustment. I've suggested that we have this be effective in 2016. It would be possible to make it effective have it be effective for January 1st, 2015, and we just build our budget around that idea. But if we wanted to build ourselves in a little bit more time for planning, the assessor of real estate is one office that would be affected by this potentially, and so I would recommend we give ourselves time to make sure we go through all the steps appropriately. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. There's no, other than the Manassas model, we have not drafted up an ordinance yet. We wanted to get council's direction. It is on your work plan, but in terms of whether the council wants to develop this ordinance and bring it forward, that's the discussion for tonight.
Council, by way of feedback on this, and John, correct me if I'm wrong on this, we had gotten feedback from the city attorney that we had the authority to essentially do this already without any charter change, but we wanted to take the first incremental step in getting the charter change to allow us to do this if we chose to, which we have. So clearly we have the ability to do it. So
Yes, that was your charter change amendment from last year to give you the local choice to do it or not.
but even putting that aside, I think the advice that we've gotten is that we could have done it even before. So why don't we go around, council members? Mr. Kale.
One question, then an observation. The actual date of then assessments would be moved from, I think the assessor starts his work in January or so, and then it's incorporated 6 months later in effect. So would the date of assessments, would he then move his work plan to do the assessments in April, or as closest to the July 1st?
There are different models from the cities that have done this. Harrisonburg has their assessments actually completed in October, so they can have all the appeals taken care of and have an ironclad number that they then take to the council, and then the assessed value after appeals takes effect on July 1st.
Of the following?
Yeah. So that's one model. Manassas moves the whole work plan forward by 6 months, and so assessments are completed and then effective on July 1st, and they don't take care of the appeals in advance. So we could work through those administrative procedures. Harrisonburg just went to the nth degree to make sure they had the most reliable number, but that requires Harrisonburg to not count 3 months of their assessments. And so that's the trade-off there. Or not count 3 months of sales when they calculate assessments.
Fair enough. I would think, given our situation, there are always going to be some, but unless there's a large number of appeals that have materially affected the amount of revenue that has been collected, which is easy to get the historical data on, what we're really saying is you're going to reduce the volatility of the projections by 60%, because that's what the real estate is. But you still have 40% or so with projection risk, but it'll be that much less, and therefore move the numbers differently. And obviously, since projections go up and down, the tax rate would, if you're planning on capital pay-as-you-go, would have to include that that component, which is particularly important if there's a downturn. And then you don't want to get stuck having to cut staff because of that. So there's going to still have to be some allowance for that. Otherwise, I think this is a good idea, and it will reduce the volatility by 60%.
Other council members? Mr. Duncan?
So if you make it effective January 1st, 2015, what budget year are we talking about? That would be FY 15-16. So we're getting ready to work on 14-15. So if we put it off until January 1st, 2016, it would be FY, some number that sounds so far out I can't think about it.
Well, if it's effective January 1st, 2015, then it's effective for the budget that you're about to consider in 3 months.
Oh.
If it's effective on the 16th, then we have a year to get ready for it, and then this time next year, the budget we start to build is when it would first become effective.
Mr. Kayla?
Getting ready is what I don't know what that means. If there are logistical problems in getting the assessor to be able to wait until or to do it in April, May, and just have that exposure for a month or so, 2 months at most, it would seem to me that you could do it at any point. I don't know what it would take a year exactly to get ready for.
It's not that complex, so I don't want to overstate it. But I do think the impact is just in terms of when you build your budget with that June assumption of a revenue increase, whether it's going to be there or not, that's one thing that you need to plan for, and how you handle that financially. It's mostly just in terms of what, where people are anchored in terms of what their expectations are for revenue growth.
I mean, that. Okay, I'm going to put my cards on the table and speak more freely than I perhaps should at times. But that's sort of what's gotten us in this mess, is that we keep relying on this notion of that we're going to run a surplus now. So what I'm hearing you say, Wyatt, is technically we can do it this year if we chose to, but it's weaning ourselves off this notion of having a surplus, which sort of is built into the planning process, which we want to get away from.
No,
right? I mean,
well, no, I'm talking about what our assumption is for the June billing. So the
is that because you haven't done the assessments? Is that what's causing the technical problem if we do it this year?
No, I'm just referring to the fact that right now we project for next June's billing, in the forecast that we provided 3 days ago, an increase in the assessed value of 1.5%. Now, you could argue whether that's the right number.
Let me ask the question this way: if we were, and again, I'm fully supportive of doing this. One, I think utilizing surpluses to continually deal with capital is not a good way of sort of managing long term. I think we just need to build in pay-go and have it programmed in, not wait for surpluses to happen before we do it. So that's point one. And two, I think we need to, given how much we rely on real estate taxes, we really need a little bit more certainty on what's happening, especially talking about the type of capital programs we're going to take on. We need sort of that long-term planning efforts without sort of having these swings. And given where we're at on the macro and microeconomics right now, both in the region and the city, we could see swings. And there's a lot of unpredictability. Just that's part of the nature of where we're at. So trying to build in predictability, I think, is a very good thing. What I'm trying to better understand is the difference between 2015 and 2015 and 2016 and when this would take effect. So my question is, do we lose any ability if we decide to do it in 2015 of accuracy?
No.
Then, given that, I would tend to favor having it sooner than later, so we can build it into this budget process, especially knowing the type of capital projects that are coming our way that we better plan for with good numbers and the best numbers we can get. And just bite the 400,000 one-time cost. Why don't we go to Vice Mayor Snyder and then come back?
Sure. Let me probe the cost a little bit. So does that mean that people, what's the effect? If there isn't $400,000 in the budget, does that mean it's $400,000 in the taxpayer's pocket? Right.
Well, I think one thing that the taxpayer benefits from most clearly is a budget that is very closely aligned now with what our revenues are going to be. And so if taxpayers are unhappy about surpluses, this will solve that. If they're unhappy about deficits because of the disruption to service levels that occur, they'll be happy about that as well. But in terms of that $400,000, where that comes from in year one, that either needs to be a budget reduction because it's in our forecast, it's money that won't be there. It is a one-time use, and so it could be, we could use funds to basically allocate it towards that transition from fund
You could
fund
use
balance.
fund balance.
So the budget, let me see if I get this right, as presented. The budget has a $400,000 hole in it, but the taxpayers aren't paying less as a result of that?
Well, yeah, let me think that through.
The point you're making is this year's budget was based upon surplus projections, and that's why you argued for a delay of a year?
Yeah, so what would happen is the taxpayer would have their increase deferred by 6 months. So if we assumed a 1.5% increase in assessed value, they're still going to pay it, but they'll pay it 6 months later than they would otherwise pay it. So that's what
Okay, well,
happens.
I think that's important. I mean, if this is a change that people are going to benefit from, then I think that's a relevant consideration. The pay-as-you-go, is that included in the $400,000? I mean, you said there's a pay-as-you-go. And the other point to make from this memo is that most cities and counties have this issue, and they've decided not to deal with it. So
That's right.
I wonder why.
That's right.
Why don't we take the first question, which is the impact on pay-as-you-go. Is that the same $400,000, or that's a different?
So the pay-as-you-go is different because we won't have surpluses anymore. It means that you really do need to build into your tax rate the capacity to do pay-as-you-go.
So the year we make this change, the impact is more than $400,000, potentially.
Yeah.
How much?
200,000 to 300,000.
So we're now up to something that costs as high as $700,000. Okay, I think that's relevant to know. Maybe that's why other cities and counties haven't made the change. I don't know, but they haven't. So I'm trying to fully understand beyond the value, and there is a value of simplicity. What's the price of that, and both for us and our taxpayers?
That's it.
And maybe it's a benefit. I don't know.
Yeah,
That's the issue.
I mean, if I can for 1 second, I mean, this is sort of I think, the issue that we've run into before is that there's a one-time cost associated with it, but it provides the flexibility. And I think one of the criticisms that the council has gotten, and certainly some of the major news outlets have written about, is that, we're overtaxing because we're running these surpluses because our projections aren't on. And now what we're talking about is essentially what we anticipate is going to be the number minus sort of on the margins of where B-poll could be off or sales or meals taxes could be off, but there's not that much swing or variance in those numbers. So clearly there's a $700,000 up to that cost. I think that's why we're taking it on, but for other jurisdictions it may be bridge too far to try to cross. I don't know if we have any idea of why other jurisdictions haven't done it, but could be because of that initial one-time cost associated with it, which is important to be cognizant of, because it's not without its cost. Ira?
Being speculative, I suspect in part why other jurisdictions haven't done it is perhaps the concept of a surplus is not as negative as it is here. Here, that means you really haven't done your job, you really screwed it up, and this is a problem. Maybe they don't have that problem where most of the world, a surplus is a good thing, not here. Which is sort of a unique situation. I think, well, this is the harder part of the explanation. You don't lose money or gain money. You just change the time period in which it's collected.
Right.
So if you have to collect $20 million, or let's say $140 million in 2 years, well, that's what you got to collect in 2 years. I mean, you can pay a little bit more year one, a little bit less, and you can continually bump it out, but eventually you got to make it up. So you're not losing money. It's when you decide that it actually, the books actually reconcile in a way that's manageable. And that's what we're talking about. This is
a good way of looking
pretty
at it.
straightforward stuff. I'll bet you that most of the other municipalities don't have the issue that surpluses are a bad thing.
The extra 200, 300,000 that you identified, that's, what is that expense?
For pay-as-you-go.
Your projected
So you're gonna-
pay-go
you're gonna
runs
build-
anywhere from $600,000 to $725,000 over the next 2-3 years.
But to Mr. Kalen's point, I think the point that's worth making again is, you know, either you pay for it now or you pay for it next year because it's going to be built into your surplus that you hope to have if you're going to do that pay-go.
Yeah.
So, you know, another way of looking at this is, I think the way that we've treated the surpluses before to pay for our capital, you know, I'm going to be brutally honest here, as somebody who's been sitting in this chair for a couple of years now, is it's sort of given us the ability to say, you know what, we're going to keep revisiting the capital improvement program because this year we didn't run a surplus or this year we ran more, so we'll make these ad hoc decisions. That will end. Either we're going to deliver on a capital improvement program or we're not. We're not going to have the ability to say, well, we ran a surplus or we didn't have a surplus, so tell us what you all think. And I'm just being brutally honest about
Yeah,
it.
that's
And,
why-
and I'm sort of, I'm
Well, you and I
committed
are
to-
on the same team, I think, on this,
I'm
because,
trying to do, I am committed to meeting our capital the most straightforward, logical way. And if that means, you know, we've got a one-time outlay, we're going to, in my view, pay it this year or next or however we do the timing, which I'm open to. But I'd rather have that predictability and to say we're going to deliver on our capital or we're not, but we're not going to continue to rely on surpluses to make those decisions, but have it be in the budget fold.
and
Either we do it or not because it's not affordable, but we just say it up front.
I'm for doing it sooner because of what you identified as the capital cost that we saw Thursday night.
Just two quick comments. I think if we say to people they can hold on to their money longer, I think that argues an additional argument for this change. If that's not what we're saying, then we better explain to people why we're creating a hole in the budget that will result in an increased tax rate sooner rather than later, maybe. The second point is, I think the issue with the capital budget is somewhat different. The issue with the capital budget is there have been huge demands, some of which are not capable of being met this year or next year, and yet they're put in as more a statement of need. So I don't think the discussion was ever meeting or not meeting the capital based upon the surplus. I think the capital budget issue is somewhat different from that, but that's an academic point. I think the real point is how do we explain to people what we're doing, why we're doing it, We know what the costs are. What are the benefits? Besides, it's simple.
And I think just to clarify the point, Dave, that I was trying to get at, it wasn't, and I should have been more precise in my language about it perhaps, but really talking about the pay-go aspects of it, of the program, which tends to be sort of these, a little bit more of the ad hoc and smaller items rather than, you know, the high school, for example, which isn't going to be funded through pay-go or surplus. But more along the lines of, you know, the smaller improvements that we're seeing that we normally do through pay-go funds. And also that we're also having the discussion about what to do with some of the less durable items like buses, et cetera. Mr. Gannon?
You mean the durable items like?
I'm sorry, the durable items like buses and cars that don't fit in with our definition of
capital.
pure capital.
I think though, just for the record, what has happened with the capital budget, Dave, is that at the end, it is what reconciles the budget. So whenever we're under pressure, we cut the capital budget. And if we don't get the revenues we want, we cut everything more. So it's really an issue that the capital budget has been the item that makes the budget come to zero at the end of the year, and it usually means cuts. And that's the problem. If we can get rid of some of that volatility, we'll know beforehand what it is we're actually going to have. And it may be that it'll be the 1 year jolt, but it's built in. So you get it 1 year or the other, and either you get people more irritated every year or you get irritated once. Take your choice.
All right.
Can I offer a third option?
Mr. Tartar, did you have any thoughts on this?
Not really. I mean, I'm certainly open to this suggestion. I guess I'd want to get my arms around a little bit more. I have to say that I somewhat understand it. I can't say I fully understand all the implications or ramifications of it, but on its face, it sounds like something we ought to be considering. That's about all I've got right now.
Okay, so is there general consensus that we want to do this? And the next issue really that we're facing is whether we do it in 15 or 16? And Dave, I think I tracked what you were saying as far as the difference between 15 and 16. So if we did 15, then taxpayers essentially keep money longer. Is that what would happen?
Yeah, the assessed value increase on their home
Just a yes or no on that
Yes.
is fine.
becomes effective 6 months later.
Okay. So
And any increase in the tax rate also becomes
So it
effective
meets
6 months later.
Vice Mayor Snyder's objective, I think, right?
But wouldn't
Yes.
we have to come up with $400,000 either in cuts or additional revenue to make up for the lag, that whatever year we do this in?
Theoretically, yes, but your problem is bigger than 400,000.
Always Mr. Sunshine.
It's a Monday. You're wearing
Monday.
purple.
Seriously, though, we
And
would
it's
have
still
to,
Happy Monday.
to make things work for the year we do this, we'd have to come up with $600,000 or $700,000 either in cuts or somehow additional revenue.
What I wrote down is that comes from fund balance. Did I not get that right?
Richard doesn't like that idea.
I know he doesn't like it, but that's what he said. That's what I wrote down.
That I said it would come from fund balance?
No, I said
No.
Oh, okay, well, I said that. Okay,
Wrong
I knew somebody
guy.
important said it.
Okay. And the answer to your question is, yes, you're going to be short revenue for that, the year we make the change.
And how would you make that up through fund balance? Is that,
It depends on what the rest of the budget looks like.
so help me out here, because I'm not
All right.
following you.
I'll give you the example, all right? We did this Thursday night. Revenue grows at 3.5%. The school district grows at 10%. When you take out the debt service, you have a $1.8 million deficit. If you did the tax rate change and you adjusted the calendar, your deficit's 2.2 million. That make it better for you?
No, I still don't
All
understand where
you
it's-
do is you're short revenue, and you're gonna have to make it up either through cuts or increase the tax rate.
But this is
It's just leading into the next item.
this
so.
is going to lead quickly into that, and again, this is why I think we haven't taken this action, because every time it comes up, it comes on the heels of the budget itself, and this is the debate that we have that's circular, and everybody says, wow, it's going to create a one-time budget gap, so let's all stand back. On this one, I mean, one way of resolving it, Richard, and I know you're going to give me 10 reasons why this is a bad idea, but we could hold everybody essentially harmless and say we're going to dip into one-time fund balance to make this change happen. We could do that.
I wrote that down.
Yes, you could do that.
And we'll have to look at the, what ramifications that may have.
Right. And what do you do when the projections for the following year are the same thing? Is it easier to dip into fund balance? Yes. And every year it gets easier. And then you have no fund balance. That's the problem.
Understood. Mr. Kayla?
Just to repeat the same, the 700,000 isn't gained or lost. It's when it's recognized. Okay, are we clear on that? All right. The issue is, do you want a one-time hurt where people get irritated, or do you want every year to go through the budget processes that we went through the last couple of years? Is that preferred because we can't make a decision on that? Because we're not capable of saying this is where it's got to stop? And Dave, if you don't understand it, please get together with Richard on this.
Look, I'm here because I imagine maybe everyone else understands that I'm the only guy in this room.
You're
If I am,
not.
then tell me.
You're not.
Because I'll do that. But if it sounds like other council members have the same questions, then it probably is appropriate for this meeting. But, so really the bottom line is, and I'm not saying I'm against it, Ira. Just because I'm asking a question doesn't mean that's my position. I want to understand what the problem is and then what possible solutions are. Well, I mean, if I'm the only person here, then stop, and we won't ask this anymore. But I guess the bottom line question is, for that 1 year, how do we do it? And I think we're getting an answer, fund balance, cuts, or I don't know what the third answer is, but that's two of the answers that are on the table. Now, your point may be that it's better to take that hit and take that pain once than do it for the next whatever years, and that may be so. But at least I'd like to understand what the first part of the question is what we do the first year. And I think I've got a pretty good idea of that, and so I'm done with my questions.
Yep, but it sounds like we've got some options of dealing with it. So, and again, my only goal with trying to separate the two out is we're not going to be able to make a decision on this if we tie it directly to how Richard would solve this problem, other than sort of notionally it can be solved through the operating budget itself, or B, which is the option that Richard doesn't like, and that's through fund balance. But it is a solvable
Or a tax
problem.
rate increase.
Or a tax rate increase,
Yeah,
which would be
yeah.
part of the operating.
You either have to generate more revenue or you have to cut expenses. That's the bottom line. How you generate more revenue is,
And to Mr. Kallen's point, it's
discussion.
either this year or the future when you have to make up for it. Even if you do nothing, you're still paying for it.
Which may illustrate, if I might, why a lot of other jurisdictions haven't done it, because they don't want to create a hole in their budget, right? And they
I-
don't want to dip into fund balance to cover that hole, so they do that. So the issue is, in the name of simplicity, how much is it worth?
that's exactly it. It's like Mr.
Now, if you can tell
Kalin.
me, on the other hand, that there's some value to the taxpayers, that is, this is money that they're keeping in their pockets X amount longer, then you begin to have another reason for supporting this. But if this is simply an accounting measure to make it seem more simple, and the cost is an increased tax rate, then that's something that's a serious matter.
But I think that's the answer that we
It's
got back.
it's subject to debate, and we can have the discussion all night. From my point of view, the only thing it does is it reduces the amount of unpredictability. Yes.
And Dave, I think to the point that you were trying to make, in 2000, if we do this in 2015, it does push back when the bills would be due by 6 months.
Yeah, so it doesn't, it just pushes it back. And the localities that have made the change tend to be localities that are smaller and have well-educated citizenry. And I think there's a correlation there, that We spend 6 months a year talking about this phenomenon, and it is a big waste of time. I mean, there's a transaction cost associated with the status quo. It's painful. It's brutal having to have this conversation every year. And I think that's what these other jurisdictions that made the change said, we're sick of it. Let's just change it and be done with it.
And I mean, and it's not just our public that's had difficulty with this. I mean, we had to remind ourselves that we had actually allocated the monies when we talked about it before. So,
All I'm looking for, I'm not interested in the public policy that says we're doing this because it's easier for us, or that we have to spend more time explaining. If the issue is it reduces volatility, that's a significant issue. If it allows taxpayers to hold on to their money longer, that's a significant issue. If it blasts a hole in the budget at a time when we're really, really stretched and it's going to force some other things to occur that we really don't want to occur, that, by the way, are worse than having to explain this, then we want to be careful what year we do this in. That's all. These are just the points I want to make. And plus a real good explanation to the public as to why we're doing it and what the ramifications are.
so why don't, I mean, I think the point of when we do it is really, is important for budgetary reasons. So we haven't formulated the budget, and again, my hope is to keep this on a policy level without sort of talking about the budget. But if that's not where members want to go, that's fine. The question for staff is, can we do it this year in 15?
No.
I'm sure I didn't write that down earlier.
And the reason I say no is that we are going to have a tough time coming up with your assessments for January. You need time for appeal so that you can resolve it.
So it's the technical issue that you're alluding to, which is what I was driving at before. So there's a technical reason of not doing it this year as opposed to 16.
You need time.
Okay.
That's what I was asking before, if there was.
I think that's how we started this discussion.
I thought under state law that all assessments were made as of fair market value as of January 1st of the year. And whether you guys, wherever you crank them out or give them to people, but I think that's the date. I thought that was the date the state mandated under state law
That's
for
right.
the actual cutoff date for value.
That's right. And so what you do, like what Manassas did, is they said, okay, that's fine, but for tax billing purposes, it's going to be effective July 1st.
Gotcha. But so the idea of when you put together your assessments and all that, I mean, that's really just when does staff get around? It's sometime January 1 on, right? Because you can look back, but you can't really look forward as to what the fair market value is going to be 3 months from now.
That's right.
At least I wouldn't think you can.
Right.
So it's really just January 1 or any time thereafter looking back to January 1. So you're saying as a matter of staffing, or what does the assessor normally do?
He does the sales through October, November, and then
Just to try to move this discussion forward, I mean, I think we've narrowed down the issues, and I think there's general consensus that we'd like to see this policy change. So the issue that I think we're grappling with is 15 or 16.
yes.
And I think there is the technical issue, which I hope that Wyatt and Richard, you'll take back, working with the assessor's office, of when can we do this? I think the sense that we're getting is I'd like to do it sooner than later, assuming that it doesn't cause technical issues, like with appeals, et cetera. And I don't want to sort of guess at it here without having the assessor here for you guys to talk about it. But I think that's the issue that's remaining, is when can we do this technically, with the understanding that it's the desire to move this policy forward as expeditiously as possible through a thoughtful process, but not causing technical problems, but yet pushing staff to get this done sooner than later. So not for, well, we got to steer the ship or X, Y, and Z, or it's painful to wean ourselves off from the surpluses, but more of technical dates given when the assessor currently takes action based on his work plan. So I think that's what we're looking at, not internal bureaucratic stuff. Does that make sense, Mr. Kalin?
Yeah, I think, Dave, there is an issue that every time we have a knockdown, drag-out discussion or disagreement on the budget every year. What I think it does is weaken public confidence about what we're knowing what we're doing. And if we could minimize that substantially, I think confidence in the city government and the city council would be enhanced. So, I mean, I think it's hard to quantify that benefit, but I think it's not inconsequential.
I agree, transparency and reduced volatility have their value.
All right.
Okay, so we will provide more information in terms of what the timing can be from both the administrative side, but also just to make sure that our taxpayers are ready for it. I think that's a key component to it.
Well, if they're getting a holiday for 6 months, that might not be a huge deal. But.
Right. But we need to be able to explain. We need to be prepared to explain that
Yes,
clearly.
absolutely.
So we want to have an additional work session discussion on this before it gets put on an agenda, or we've got two. If this isn't on the 25th agenda, then it will be the next council that enacts the change, and we'll have to explain to them the misalignment, which might take us 6 months.
Why don't we see where we're at, Wyatt? Why don't we do it as a? Why don't we try to aim for next week if we can nail down some of the technical issues, and if we have to do this as sort of a work session, I'm happy to suspend the rules so we can have some discussion and debate about it. Is that doable? I mean, having the next council debate this is.
It's a demanding task.
Yes. Taxing. Taxing.
And they're going to have plenty on their plate. So.
Okay, we will work with that goal. Thank you.
Okay. Now to budget guidance. If anybody's got any more steam.
Everybody's standing up.
Do people need like a couple minutes? Okay. Why don't we take about 5? Why don't we come back at 10:15?
From 6 to 11, that's the story.
Yeah, so that would explain it to me. Right. I see, so when you say it's curious, so it's not 24 including this, it's like, so when you throw in all the.
Did you all get?
That's big. 661. It's 50%.
Later. Anyway, Leslie's off and I'll easily got through the highest tax rate.
This assumes
New Hampshire to get his mom on
that's
the
not
weekend.
true.
Well, I don't reason. Years before I became a
Shall the city issue bonds?
Because like for public school.
June sounds so far away, I couldn't tell you. Yes.
They're talking. Sorry, my question is for them.
We went one year,
Yes. 16, 19, and that has to be sorted in the high school.
the big one, the dorm, the big one, the quad and all that. And we didn't have a key. We already took it in. Well, that's what we remember, right? Works in San Paul. Yeah, it was kind of. I thought you had the key. When were you the key? And then I know when you left.
I don't care what you do, it's gotta be 6.
Well,
So for FY 15, 6.
Yeah, that was just.
This is
Just should be
what you're saying is
it's just on the debt service.
But is the 6 in addition to the 5?
It's probably some portion of that. With the existing debt service.
She was my
School
son.
interest,
What
the
class
deficit is.
I was actually 30th anniversary of the class.
So it's almost there.
That's what
35th.
I see you're already
Really?
anticipating revenue from.
Yeah, mine did.
So that helps somewhat, but doesn't solve the problem.
I went to my I go to
Why are we missing?
That's my mindset right now. Maybe I'll get a better attitude about it.
They don't know it's $8 million deficit out there. You can tell taxpayers anything you want. You go in there with it, you took the pot.
Doesn't disappear.
Oh, it says in it?
Because they sort of don't keep all cities together.
Question for
Look, man, I gotta know what I wanna vote for, so, I mean, that was the idea.
Or she's
behind it.
he's a snotty kid. I mean, I just thought it seemed to me since you said you were unaware of it, so.
I wasn't aware of it, I wanted to know the implications, it sounded like more than,
Yeah.
I was the only one either who felt that way.
Because, you know, you can have this theoretical discussion about changing the date. All it does is answers your.
You guys should we start it back in?
Yeah, I just wanted to get through the transition.
I did some
Question.
look at this.
I did look at the slide for, for the school board, no, I wasn't at the meeting.
I know.
If I'm gonna get to the Giant, time to buy myself a steak for tonight. You gotta be done before 11.
A steak?
Yes, big T-bone steak.
Is there a T-bone steak sale up there?
Waiting for me up at the Giant. Yeah, I gotta get, it closes at 11, so.
So I should go past 11?
We,
Without me, yes.
All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? Ira, Dave?
That went well.
yeah, good. We got
All right,
I would like to get it
so why don't we get rolling on the manager's budget guidance. So I'd asked Wyatt to send out the last 2 years as well. So did that go around, Wyatt?
You know what? I have them upstairs on the printer. Can you grab the prior 2 years? Yeah, they're in the. Sorry about that, Cindy.
Sure. Wyatt, do you want to go ahead?
So what is in the packet is last year's budget guidance for the FY14 budget development and the presentation that we discussed last Thursday. And the goals for tonight, I think, is just to get council's input in terms of the key things that you would like to see in the FY15 budget, and so that we can take notes on that and then come back with a draft budget guidance statement for FY15 budget development. This year is unique in that we have a new council taking effect in January. I think we need to acknowledge that. I will say that the goal of budget guidance is to make sure that our system of government, the council manager form of government, where the manager needs to deliver to the council what the council's expectations are, that having that work in advance to lay out some of the large big picture expectations makes for a smoother process. And I think it's been effective for the 3 years that we've done it, and would recommend that the council consider doing it again this year. In terms of specifics, in our discussion last Thursday, we did highlight the challenges we have on the capital side. And so last year's budget guidance did put emphasis on capital planning as sort of a key area of focus in the budget. And I would expect that again will be, one of the big challenges that the council will have to wrestle with next spring is wrestling with developing a financial plan to accomplish these capital goals.
So just by way of background of what we've done in the past, why it's working up bringing the sheets over, is last year what we said is basically any budget increases in general government expenses are generated solely by economic growth. So it's supposed to be a tax rate neutral budget in essence. What we've done in years past is either said the budget can grow by, pick a number as a floor or ceiling. That's how we've done it before, or we've tried to do a ceiling and a floor together in one set of guidance. So we've sort of done it in multiple ways. The key themes that we've had in all of the budget guidance so far is the notion of focusing on capital. So just looking at the last year's guidance, the key operative section, not to say that the others aren't operative, but for the operating budget piece, it's really the second bullet point that was the operative language that was present a budget in which any increases in revenue for general government expenses are generated solely by economic growth, which is essentially a zero tax rate increase. At least that was the intent when we drafted it, I think. So my suggestion would be some of the other paragraphs we would want to keep. The other sort of pertinent paragraph is 1, 2, 3, 4, bullet 4, which is present a budget with no less than 1.3 mil in revenue used only for additional pay-go capital. That was another sort of operating key piece. The rest of it was sort of focusing on capital general language. But those are the two sections that I've been able to identify that actually have operative language in it, per se, rather than policy-focused language. Does that make sense to everybody as far as what we did last year? So just my 2 cents would be we can probably keep most of the paragraphs, and the focus of the discussion should try to be on what we tried to aim to do on the operating side and what we tried to do on the capital side and pay-go.
Could I suggest maybe a variation? First of all, that we state that we're going to maintain the quality of the schools and public services. In other words, we state the reason why we exist, we're going to do well. Secondly, that we maintain the recommended fund balance as a minimum.
So, Dave, just so we can put some meat on what you're saying, so it's essentially expanding the opening chapeau paragraph. Because we talk about providing valuable core services that promote public safety and high quality of life, but expanding on that.
Yeah.
And then adding a paragraph about fund balance.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that's in there right now. Yeah, I don't see it in there. I don't see that paragraph in there. So it'd be adding that about
Right.
fund balance.
Mhm.
Others? Anything else, Dave? Mr. Charter?
A couple comments or thoughts. I mean, one, we've got a number here for capital improvements, yet we also, I don't know how this comes into play, like, for example, the money we're going to get from the state for transportation improvements, which in some ways is a dedicated source of capital improvements for us. Do we know what that number is approximately?
About 2 million?
We're talking about the 30% MBTA
Yes.
funding?
Yes.
It'll be around 850,000 if council continues to fund our local match, either with the revenue sharing 800,000 that we just did at the last council action, or some regular funding source to your special fund. You only get it if you match it, and you don't have a plan yet for FY15.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess what I would say is, first off, we need to match it. I mean, that's just throwing money away, right? Unless we come up with 800 grants. So that'd be something I would like to make sure we do, whether it's through here or just through our budget, but make sure we don't, as a policy, that we're going to catch that match every year. I think in some degree it sort of comes into play too. If you're going to put a number here, $1.3 million in revenue, we've got a match, and we've also got dedicated funding of our own, 800,000.
So why don't we do this, Dave, to your point, add a separate paragraph talking about sort of the grant and matching capital programs, just so it's a delineated item? Is that what you're driving at?
I guess so. I mean, I want to make sure we catch it, and that's a policy that we do.
But I think we can highlight that by its own bullet.
That's fine. I guess also it sort of comes into play in this $1.3 million number. In
Right.
some ways, it's sort of already taken account of other things, even stormwater management, for example. I view that as sort of the same way. It's a capital improvement budget that we're taking out of our own budget as a city and put it into a separate budget item, which is the stormwater management enterprise fund. So I'm not sure how to articulate that through this, but I think we should keep that in mind. They were spending money on capital improvements now outside the city budget, and it may be a substantial amount. So I think we should just keep that in mind going forward. And I guess to your point too, Dave, a bullet about requiring that we keep a capital budget or a fund balance at all times. I mean, that may go in the wayside in year one if we in fact do the switch over to the years lining up. So,
Well, keep in mind that the recommended fund balance is the 17%, right?
Over it.
That's what our CFO has said, that's what the group representing CFOs have said. We have a bit over that, but we also realize that we're facing capital. I sound like Ira. I wanted you to know some of it sinks in. That we're facing significant capital expenditures in the future, and we need to maintain the bond rating through all of this. So one point is that we maintain the recommended fund balance at a minimum.
I'm not against it. I'm just
Yeah.
pointing out that if we do the changeover, it sounds like one of the ways that we'll get there is actually by using the fund balance the first year.
Well, and we've been advised, I think, that needs to be a
We need
further
to
discussion.
think through that.
And then I would not support cutting it below the 17% at the very least. So, because I think once you do that, it sends a signal to Wall Street that we're not able to discipline ourselves, and it may create a precedent. People will forget that this was one time and will create an impression. So it seems to me, for all these reasons, some sort of, and I don't think we're disagreeing really, that we maintain the recommended fund balance.
Well, and I guess I would say that for our discussion about the changeover, that we have some other options, because if we're not going to go below 17%, then it may mean some kind of either tax increase or some budget cuts to get through that first year, right?
That's correct.
All right, so I think we need to have those options just brought if we're going to take the one off the table.
Mr. Callen?
Thanks, Dave. You've been a good student. What can I tell you? The third bullet point, which is the policy issue, this is important because there's going to be a ton of pressure on the tax rate. We knew this last year, that the 15 was going to have a lot of pressure on the tax rate, and it may be why it's even useful to start out with, if you want to let the general public know that the guidance would probably have to allow for the fact that if we expect the school operating budget to go up 10%, and we know that the city expenses will probably go up, what, 5%, perhaps, depending, let's say 5%, that the average is going to be closer to 7%, and that the tax rate's going to have to bear a part of that. If the city says we would like to achieve this without that tax rate, and we want to do cuts in expenditure, I think it's very important that the city council take responsibility for that. And that what is very difficult, I think, for management is to say, we have a $2 million shortfall, figure it out, and maintain city services and cut $2 million. Well, that can't work, because it changes the vision of the city if you're going to make cuts of that nature. So the council really should be responsible for those decisions because of the enormous impact that they will have. God bless you guys. You're going to have a real opportunity to see what the budget discussions are like. But it's going to be tough sledding. There's no way to avoid it. If we need a tax increase, you let people know early on so that it's clear.
Two points that I want to just add, just echoing off what Vice Mayor Snyder suggested off the regarding the fund balance. I think it's just worth noting that something to the effect of all other financial policies should also be followed. So there's no notion that they won't be, since we're highlighting one. Agreed that the fund balance is sort of the driving rock behind a lot of them, but we should probably indicate that others should be followed. And then two, I'm going to make the pitch again this year that we continue to work on the multi-year modeling and forecasting. And I'll put it out there again, at least my expectation is going to be that we have, while we don't have a line by line 2-year budget, nor do we adopt a 2-year budget, that we have essentially 2-year guide of where our budgets are going to be next year in a much more robust way that we've seen than last year. I know that we've made some incremental steps, but my hope is that we can really start getting into 2-year budgeting, understanding that the charter does not allow us to adopt a 2-year budget. So I'd like to
notional agreement?
a notional sense of where we're headed in the 2 years. And again, unlike the actual fiscal year operating budget where it's line by department, even if it's a general line by department rather than the sublines, I think that would be helpful. So I hope that we can get there next year. And I think that's had support at least for the last 2 years.
That's where you'll see the transfer from year to year. If we don't align it this year, take the 700,000, it just shows
Yep.
up next year.
Yep.
So the 2-year notional will absorb that.
So I would just add that in as one of the requests, and that we actually try to do it this year. Mr. Duncan, did you have anything?
Thank you. Yes, I had 4 or 5 things I wanted to rattle off because Richard told me that I should speak earlier than I did last time, so I'm going to set out things that I would like to see accomplished if it's possible. First was align the fiscal year and the tax year, so we've talked about that, and for all the reasons related to confidence, I think that's a very important step. Second, I would like to see us set, realistic hard targets for CIP numbers for the library, City Hall, and the school. I may be ambitious, but I think, as the mayor said earlier, the more amorphous and out there those numbers are, the less people understand why we're collecting their taxes. And I just think that we need to bite the bullet and really try to come up with numbers for those big capital projects that mean something. You offered some of them at the meeting on Thursday, and that's a good start, but there seemed to be some resistance, ambivalence at that meeting, and I would like to push everybody not to allow that to carry on. The problem that I have with the third bullet and council taking responsibility for reductions, is that, at least my experience with the budget last time, and really with our, council manager form of government, which we're just not, council members not really equipped to do the kind of line-by-line cutting that is envisioned in that bullet point. And so I don't have a good solution to that, but, I feel like year after year, we hear a good bit of citizen input about streamlining, consolidation, operational efficiencies, and so forth. And it's not like, we're excess on employees or anything like that, but yet I feel like there is in the community a sense that between the schools division and City Hall, some consolidations of some functions, if they were explored and pursued over a multi-year time frame, might save some money, whether it's in communications or human resources or maintenance or whatever. So what I'm asking for is for you all to think about some way to put together a high-level blue ribbon panel of people who really know how the schools in the city work to advise either you, really more council, but to give us some real advice about whether operational consolidations could occur that would save us some money. So that's an ask. Efficiency and streamlining, I call it, I suppose, operational efficiencies, whatever. The other point was, what are we going to do with the water money? I haven't heard anybody mention that, but that's like $13 million, right? So let's talk about that. And fund balance, two final points. Fund balance, we're going to hew to the fund balance policy. Well, we ran into this problem, I ran into this problem last spring. The fund balance policy actually says 12 to 17%. That's the policy. But that's not how we operate with it now. 17% is a floor, not a ceiling. And, we had some frank and open exchanges of views about that, but I'm willing to go wherever everybody wants to go, but I do think 17% is the ceiling. And then once we get above that ceiling with whatever money we're going to have extra, now maybe we'll have less extra if we align the years, goes into some other hard good, like police cars or fire trucks or whatever. But an undesignated fund balance in excess of 17%, particularly if we align the years, should not be allowed. To me, that's as bad as it being under 12%. That's just my personal opinion. And finally, I would like to put down a marker right now that I would like to see a level tax rate option presented to council, whatever that entails. It entails a basket of all the things that I've mentioned, really. And I don't want you to do anything that violates your conscience policy or standards of ethical conduct, but I do want to see a realistic flat tax rate option that we can take to the public and say, this is what you are and are not going to get if we kept your tax rate stable, rather than have me, at the 11th hour try to come in and cobble one together, which was, a game effort, but, I wasn't up for it. Okay, thanks.
Can I just throw one caveat into that? I think, Mr. Duncan, you hit on sort of all the key bullets. If we are, and again, we're going to have to see, I think we're going to need one more work session on this. But if we are going to start talking about a no tax rate increase, I think based on what we know that is going to create deficits. I think that we do need to provide some policy direction, while it may not be line items of areas at minimum, or else the city manager is going to propose things that are non-starters, and we're going to end up making decisions last minute that are not sound. And I think that's what we have run into in past years, not during this council, but that's a road we've gone down before, and it's things that are going to be not acceptable. And
yeah, the Washington Monument Strategy, I agree with that. And I think the sooner we can talk about the kind of efficiencies that I am being vague in general about, the better, for all the reasons that the mayor sets forth.
Mr. Kaler?
Well, I have to say for the record, I don't think what you're recommending is even remotely possible. The fact is that the city is thinly staffed already. It's got operational risk that's substantial, and it's not been properly staffed. You cut it further, and the risks just increase to a level, then people will complain when something happens. In terms of the consolidation, if I recall, this has been an ongoing process, and it's never yielded anything because it takes, I won't go through who's responsible for what, but it's never worked, and I don't see that anything has changed that would alter that. As far as the 17% goes, Phil, the 17% is a low target. The 12% is if we run into something that's absolutely catastrophic and it falls below 12%, and we might even have to do an emergency tax rate increase to cover. It is not something that you allow to drop to, because if you voluntarily run your fund balance down, it tells the markets that we are undisciplined. David is absolutely right. That without any stress, we solve our financial problems through cutting the fund balance. And then we go out and we want to have a substantial capital program. It makes no sense. Let's cut to the chase. There's only one item that's big enough to absorb the types of shortfalls that we're looking at, and that's public safety. And no one wants to cut public safety. And that's 16% of the budget. That's where the largest other cost driver or benefit driver, whatever you want to call it, you can't talk and jolly our way through this. There's going to be some very hard decisions, and they're going to be winners and losers. And I disagree. The issue isn't the small changes. Maybe why I could do 5%, maybe a little bit more on the edges. But the real issues, if we're running significant shortfalls, are going to be cuts in programs. You can't fund and have offices that have 2 people in them. You got to eliminate the program. And now we're going to look at a very different type of city. So it's not doable the way you've presented it. Now, I won't be here to live with the results. Others will, but it's not going to work out. It's not going to work out well. Make no mistake. This is very naive to think this could be done. On the other hand, this issue of the proceeds of the sale, in FY14, I see 15.5 million in capital, right, on page 9. That entire amount could be covered and paid for without a tax rate increase if the recommendations that I have made regarding the investment of the proceeds is done. That, the FY14 program could be covered in full if the 13 million were used with no tax rate increase in perpetuity. And that would free up another $15 million for capital expenses elsewhere. That's why that's a savings, okay? That's where real savings could take place. Financial management of that nature. Otherwise, we're just nibbling around at the edges, and it's going to be a very long and difficult discussion when you guys have it in March and April.
Other council members?
If I could, let me ask you about the line on the presentation about water admin allocation, which is going down $1.1 million. Is that because the water sale will conclude and we will lose $1.1 million in revenue that was otherwise associated with the operation of the water authority by the city?
That's correct.
So what are we doing to plan for that? And this is something that I mentioned 6 months ago or a year ago when we were discussing the possible sale of the system. What is it as a city we're doing to deal with that issue? Because we're going to lose a significant amount of revenue. That's 3 cents in the tax rate. What are we doing to plan for that so that we can take that hit?
Well, we've got essentially 6 months to plan for it. I mean, we've known this is coming, but we've also been very clear that in terms of the specific costs that are associated with that administrative cost allocation, those cuts don't suggest themselves. And so we've got more work to do on that. I mean, that's going to be one of the things we have to solve for in the FY15 budget.
But just on that, not to pile on this, but this is, but to pile on. I mean, this is a discussion that some of us were frustrated is probably an understatement. So we've sort of gone around and around on that. And just to be clear, my expectation is that, you know, given the amount of time and lead-in, that the manager would have figured out some reorganization that needs to happen and restructuring in City Hall. And this gets to Mr. Duncan's point. The council can't sort of solve for all of it, and I don't think you're going to be able to close the entire gap, but there are some efficiencies that I think that we're going to have to consider, that we're going to be looking to you to determine. I mean, part of your salary, part of Richard's salary, part of our salary is tied to the water system. And if we're not going to be doing that, we should be doing something else. And that means some reorganization that needs to happen. And I think the last thing you want is a council trying to dictate to you how that reorganization should happen to cover the 1.3 million. So that's as direct as I can put it, but it's an issue that we've known about for quite some time that is going to take some reorganization in some ways of managing to cover some of it. And I don't think it's going to cover all of it, but at least part of it. Mr. Kalin?
I hope you're not misrepresenting my position. It wasn't that every single thing has to come back to the major expenses. Now, I just don't know. Maybe you can find it. It's unclear to me with the way we operate how you could save per se $1 million without cutting. You can work it out. There are ways perhaps to cut some of it. I'm not saying that there's some, and it's not line by line. The city council should never do it line by line. There's no question about that. But for the substantial, and this is where the city manager would have to help us out, is where cuts are such that it would require the elimination of programs. That should be a council responsibility. He can identify them, and he could lead the council through to where these would be found, but the council would have to actually say it's something that the council wanted to do. By coincidence, if you didn't want to use the funding of the proceeds for debt service at $13-14 million, it's about $1 million a year in savings just from the technique that we use.
I think the point that I was making is I'm considering what Mr. Duncan and what Mr. Tartar are talking about, two separate issues. On the water issue, we've known that this has been coming for months, and I think numerous members of council have said we need to solve for this, and it's going to be some type of reorganizational issues that are going to have to be dealt with on how we're structured to close part of that gap. That's a separate issue than what I think Mr. Duncan's talking about, but my only point is I don't want to be presented with, well, council now has to work on the reorg on the water side. I mean, those are some issues we've known have been pending, and we got to come up with solutions to try to close that gap.
Yeah, if I could, I agree with that 100%. I am looking for a big thing. I mean, I'm looking for a kind of change in our mindset when it comes to the way we operate a number of our lines of business. I mean, I'm just struck when I go around town that everybody thinks that they get to have their every little thing, and we're just too small for that to be the case going forward. And I won't bore you with too many examples, but when we were talking about the library, the librarian talked to the schools, and oh no, there's just no possible way that the kids' library at the schools and the kids' library at the library could possibly ever work together. Well, you know what? I just don't see that as a viable option going forward. We're going to have to share. We should share. We're a community. Law enforcement. I come from a background, in that. My family, we're not going to short shrift it, but are there efficiencies to be achieved? I mean, again, I'm not the manager, and I'm way not capable of doing this, but I do want to just put a marker down early on that, human resources, communications. I do a good bit of work with a cable TV station, it could be better. Just in my experience going around town, there are things that people could do that address Mr. Kalin's very legitimate problem about redundancy. You know, we got 2 people over here who do this, and we got 2 people over here who do this, and this one goes away, and now there's only one. Well, what if those 4 people work together? Because they basically do the same thing, you know? Because I spend a lot of time figuring it out, that's why. And you know, that's where you get your savings. That's where you get your redundancy, you know. The 3 people who are here then figure out a way to get the most important work done, so the 4th one can be off for a while. I mean, I'm not a rocket scientist, but I know that there is money out there that can be saved if we just apply ourselves to it, I think.
Well, there is an easy zero tax rate scenario, and that is everybody grows at what the economy gives you. The scenario that we gave you is one where the schools grow 10%, and then you need a 5-cent tax increase. General government grows at what the economy gives you, and the schools grow, and you need a 5-cent increase to do that. That's what we did last year. Last year, we cut the 1.3 million out of capital to reduce the tax rate. But I will tell you, going through cut scenarios, because you're going through a recession, people get that. We go through the efficiency. I will say that all of our cuts were in the city manager's suite and in admin and those types of back office things. We didn't cut many programs. We can, what it will take is really revisioning how we deliver services and stopping certain services. I mean, that's what it is all about. And that's a, you know, that's a big discussion. And we can always deliver services better. That is something we always have to try to do. But I will say that downsizing or cutting and the context of doing that in order to increase the school transfer by 10% is a discussion that is, you know, from a management challenge, is a very high degree of difficulty. And so if we were going to have a zero increase scenario, I think it is one where there would have to be a sense that the schools and the general government are in that scenario together. Otherwise, I think as a planning exercise, it's A, harmful, but 2, it's so academic that you know, whether it actually gives the council a good option, I'd be doubtful of.
If I may, understand and agree. And one of the reasons that I'm so insistent on hard numbers for the CIP, I mean, you know, we went on a diet when we built Mary Ellen Henderson, and the schools accepted that they were not going to get as much as they thought they should get. They never do, but that particularly, those 3 years particularly, when it succeeded. I mean, to me, we are on the brink, should be on the brink of trying to get a school open 4 years from right now. And that enables me to go to the school community and say, you know what, we love to give you everything that you want based on your enrollment, but you know what, we're trying to get a school built here, and it's a big number. And I feel like we need to talk about that now and get on with it.
And I think that's the strategic discipline on operating budgets discussion, that it was one of the bullets listed. If we're going to achieve the capital, there has to be a buy-in. And Mr. Sharp raised the diet idea that was part of the Mary Ellen Henderson discussion. So I think that is, you know, that's one approach that is going to be necessary to accomplish the CIP on the scale that we have.
Thank you for hearing me out. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Other council members, and then I want to try to wrap this up. Ira?
Why, it will be a diet, it'll be water only. Okay, the numbers are too different, okay? 30 million for Mary Ellen versus 100 million, plus all the other CIP stuff is really a different order of magnitude. And I'd like to correct something I read in the one of the comments to an article in the electronic newspapers. The requirement to go to referendum is basically should be 10% of revenues, anything of an issue, 10% of revenues or greater goes to referendum. The financing of that is a separate issue. It doesn't really affect the need to go. As long as the city is issuing a bond over 10%, then it has to go through. how we finance it doesn't affect the need or not need to go to referendum. So, because in the end of the day, the bond is in the city's name, and all the taxpayers are gonna be responsible to cover any payment interruptions that take place if the financing plan that is presented does not work as expected. So the exposure is whatever the borrowing amount is, and then the financing plan, depending on how solid it is, would help determine whether we should go to referendum and the interest rate that will be charged to the city to get that amount of money, depending on the quality of the financing plan. And at $100 million, a 1% change is enormous. That's an enormous change in the cost of the city because of the size of the debt. So again, the need for referendum is not related to the financing package.
Other council members?
Yeah,
Dave?
let me offer a couple comments. I want to reiterate where I started, which is I'm not going to sacrifice the quality of the schools or the quality of basic services. So wherever else the particular numbers drive us, to me, that's number one. Number two is we've got to maintain a responsible fund balance, because if we don't, we really are going down a slippery slope that is something we don't want to do. Number three, which I haven't mentioned before, is I want us to look at our tax deferral ordinance with regard to senior citizens. I think it's not being taken up on, and I think the city's long-term interest from a lot of standpoints is keep in mind I'm saying deferral, not tax excuse, if you will. So those are a couple of the factors that are important. I think there's already a bullet in here from prior year that talks about looking at consolidation of services and reviewing those. I think that makes sense to keep that in there. So those are some of the elements that are critical to me. With regard to putting a particular dollar out there now, I mean, I don't know where we're going to be at this point. It sort of seems to me kind of artificial. But anyway, these are the kinds of things that are important to me.
The tax deferral is very attractive, except that actually, when you work through the numbers, it's perverse, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Because if you defer the taxes, that means the remaining taxpayers have to pay a higher rate. And then when the people sell their house, they have to pay back a tax that was at a higher rate. It's the price of money deferred. So it actually...
Well, if there's another alternative to deal with the liquidity issue, the irony here is that because of public investments, we're building up the value of a long-term asset, namely the home. But as has been repeated to me going door to door, there's a liquidity issue for a lot of seniors, and in fact, we have an economic interest in keeping the seniors in their homes as long as possible. And a social and community interest. So if there's a different way. Yeah. Yeah.
Can we save this for the policy discussion? Because that's going to be
let's keep going all night.
a couple hours.
But if there's a better way to do it, yeah.
I think that's
I'd just like to echo the call for flat tax rate, just some information on that that you heard earlier. No, the idea that going forward that we consider that option as well. I don't think it is. I don't think it is.
Everybody grows at 3.8%.
I gotcha.
You have a $288,000 surplus. It does not deal with PAYGO. So if you wanted to put $288,000 in PAYGO, you could, and your budget's balanced with no tax rate increase.
Well, I mean, as we go forward through this process, I'd like a more sophisticated analysis, same kind of analysis we're going to parse, presumably a 3.8%. Budget increase, or I think that's the number I saw in here. Is that not the number I saw in here? I mean, that thing's going to have every little drop in it. I don't want to just kind of give a broad brush to, okay, well, that's a number. You know, last year went through this process. I think it was 3.8% that got pulled out of wherever. And what's that? Well, it was a number that got set in the fall when I first came on. I frankly didn't know the importance of it because by the spring we hadn't moved a penny off of it, and so that number really got, through whatever reason or through whatever means, to really take a life of its own, and it really was very difficult to move off that number. And so I don't want, if we do put this 3.8 number in here to come spring to say, well, everything's based on that. You got to go find your own savings, Dave. Go, go look line by line in the budget and try to find another $100,000 here or there if you want to keep the tax rate flat. I mean, I think we should get some cooperation on that from you all, and I would hope that we can. And so that's the point.
I mean, this is a central point. So I would suggest that council members think about sort of that piece of the guidance of whether we say it's going to be, flat, which is growth within economic growth, or if it's going to be a percentage increase, or it's going to be a base or a floor, or sort of a flat rate. 'Cause that's going to be where the manager is going to go. So if members want to really consider a flat, that is going to have significant ramifications. And the whole budget discussion is going to be very different than it would be otherwise. So it's not going to be just an academic exercise. There's a ton that's going to go into that staff time. And I'm not saying it should or shouldn't, but if that's where council members want to go, we should have a robust discussion about it at a work session.
To me, I think having a range of discussion is appropriate, a range of consideration. I don't see how we can today say the number should be 3.8%, and let's just base everything for the next 6 months on that.
That's not what anybody's saying.
Well, it's what happened last year. We came up with the number 3.8%, and that number stayed throughout the whole process.
What was stated last year was.
It did. That's what the city budget stayed exactly that through the whole process.
And why did you use fund balance to balance your budget?
Well, at the end of the day, look, I don't want to get into all the minutia of last year's budget.
3.5 cents. That's not
Well,
minutia.
it's the details of the
3.5
budget.
3.5 cents and 1.4 million of your fund balance. That was not where we started.
It may have been where you started, but your budget number was the same. The 3.8% in city expenditures was where we started from,
But
where we ended up.
Dave, to your point, if we need to put in a range, we can.
Let's do a range. That's what I'm asking
So,
for.
that can be another way of dealing with it.
That's what I'd like to do, is just have
but
a range.
But I think we've hit some good points this evening, but at the end of the day, I think we do need to provide some guidance along the lines of point 2 or bullet 2 that it gets to, and it can be a range all the way from flat to pick a number of cents.
Well, that's fine. That's what I'd like to do, is have a range. And if you want to have the discussion tonight, we can. We can put it off to another day.
I think
But
it's gonna-
I think
I
the
mean-
idea of a range is just is appropriate to do, not to pick a number at this point. And again, we'd make a decision at a later point. This would just be for purposes of getting some budgeting, some feedback on the ramifications of a flat budget, the ramifications of a 3.8% budget would be X or Y. The schools can go this way, we can go this way, so we can hopefully through the process work out the details of this as we go along.
And that makes sense. But at the end of the day, we're going to get to a point where the manager is going to need some definitive guidance on what his revenue is.
Well, I agree
And
with that at
again,
the end of
that's
the day.
not tonight,
I don't think
it's not at
today.
the work session, it's somewhere through the process. And it cannot be, as, again, we didn't see it happening during this council term, but some of us have lived this before, where it was the eve of, or a few days before, where we were cutting things out.
So that's why that's why I want to have the discussion now.
Yeah,
And
no,
not
that
wait
makes sense.
till.
I'm not debating the virtues of a range. That makes sense. My only point is that range needs to land somewhere in the midst of the process, not at the end. That's my only
I agree
ask.
with that entirely.
So, and I'm not suggesting you're saying otherwise, but. All right, okay. So I think, Wyatt, you've got some feedback tonight.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the range, just so everybody's on the same page, if there were a range that requires cuts, then my assumption is going to be that those cuts are going to be equal between the general government and schools.
Well, that's something we should probably discuss, and I don't know if we want to have the discussion right now, we can, but I think the idea is we're starting the process of having those discussions, and I don't think you have to need a decision tonight unless you're going to go home, and start working on the budget. And so,
But I will draft up budget guidance, language for you all to look at your next work session. And, I think as a planning exercise, that's a coherent planning exercise. A planning exercise that doesn't look at the whole, I think, is just, in terms of the.
Let me say there's a communications issue that we could get into with the school board, and I really don't want that at this stage. I think if we're gonna, it better be clearly explained what we're doing, because otherwise it's gonna be misunderstood. So I would rather not that be the assumption at this point. I think we need some more discussion about ranges, what they would be and how they would be implied. But I don't want to come away from this meeting with us having said something about the schools without talking to the school board.
Well, I agree with that too, but I mean, if you say the whole, that's why I presented the whole list. I mean, I want to talk to the schools about their budget and their CIP. I want us to talk about our CIP. I mean, I'm very much trying to present a whole package. I want to talk about, consolidation. I have some
Well, I think
ideas.
that's-
I want
I
to talk
think,
about,
in terms
filling ground
of-
floor retail to get more money in. I mean, yeah, I agree. It's all part of a whole. But let's,
In terms of administrative efficiency, we are a smaller organization without the water. So can we be more administratively efficient by sharing services with the schools? The school board has stated they don't want to have that conversation. And so, to revisit it, we need to have that discussion again at the highest levels.
All right. Okay, very good. Anything else on the calendars or comments? Yeah.
There was an article in one of the electronic newspapers regarding disagreement between the planning director and the zoning administrator. And it was pretty almost inflammatory article about a disagreement. I'm sure it wasn't as dramatic as it was presented. So if we could get something to explain, it may be distributable, saying there may be understanding or something like that. Otherwise, it sounds like there's a clear breakdown in operations of the city.
So Wyatt, if you can report on that sooner than later. Other council members? Anything on the schedule? Mr. Duncan? You're good? All right. I can get a motion to adjourn, please.
who to adjourn?
It's Mr. Duncan, second. Mr. Kalen on the second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? We're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.